This hearing of the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee will come to order. And I appreciate our panelists' indulgence. We were informed a while back that we were going to have a number of votes, so we're trying to juggle it, and appreciate all of our senators and those who are participating in today's hearing, their willingness to work with us to try and accommodate that schedule. Today we convene the committee's first hearing of the 114th Congress to consider an issue that's divided policymakers for more than a decade: how best to protect the open Internet. The Federal Communications Commission believes it already has the answer: impose public utility regulations on the Internet. But there's a well-founded fear that regulating the Internet like a public utility monopoly will harm its entrepreneurial nature, chill investment, and lead to prolonged litigation. Instead of using outdated regulations, I believe the most enduring way to protect both the Internet and individual Internet users is through legislation that establishes clear rules of the digital road, as well as clear limits on the FCC's regulatory authority. Certainty about how consumers will be protected and certainty about the government's role in the online world is critical to preserve the Internet as an engine for innovation, creativity, economic growth, and free expression. I want us to pass legislation providing certainty that users will have unfettered access to the entire Internet. I want us to pass legislation that provides certainty for creators at the edge of the Internet so that they can continue to reach users across the Internet without interference. I want us to pass legislation that provides certainty for Internet service providers about precisely what rules they will be required to follow. And I want us to pass legislation that provides certainty for the FCC so that it can enforce legally sound open Internet rules that survive beyond the current administration. The entire Internet needs this kind of statutory certainty, and only Congress can provide it. Last week, I put forward a set of 11 principles that I believe can be the framework for a bipartisan consensus. The discussion draft that Chairman Upton and I released is our attempt to turn these principles into statutory text. The details matter greatly in this debate, and we felt there could be no progress toward a solution until legislators started discussing those details. I do not expect our draft to be a final product, but I also believe that it is not a partisan starting point to the conversation. We put forth a good faith proposal to find common ground between the parties. We hope today's hearings will facilitate a serious conversation around a long-term solution. I'm willing to discuss how the 11 principles will be implemented, and I'm eager to get to work with my colleagues, many of whom I've already spoken with. But I also want to be clear that I will not compromise these principles, particularly if doing so would leave the FCC's authority unbounded or would leave open the possibility for harmful regulatory burdens being leveled on the Internet. Chairman Upton, Chairman Walden, and I have been working with our colleagues on the Commerce Committees and across the aisle since late last year to find a lasting resolution that protects the open Internet. My colleague, the new ranking member of this committee, Senator Bill Nelson of Florida, has been serious and substantive discussions with me. I appreciate his efforts, and they underscore that there is a bipartisan interest in finding a legislative solution. In the absence of clear legislative guidance, the FCC has floundered for more than a decade to forge its own regulatory powers from legal authorities crafted prior to the emergence of the Internet as the most consequential communications platform of our lifetime. We've now reached an unfortunate point where both the President and the Chairman of the FCC feel compelled to move forward using a toolbox built 80 years ago to regulate a literal monopoly. And they do so without any apparent interest in working with Congress to solve the FCC's legal dilemma. Even if the executive branch seems willing to go alone down a politically toxic and legally uncertain path, I sincerely hope that a willingness to collaborate develops within the legislative branch. After a decade of failure and wasted taxpayer resources, we should not continue to leave this issue to a 5-member regulatory agency. Congress needs to reassert its responsibility to make policy and let the FCC do what it does best: enforce clear statutory rules. I want to work together with my colleagues to finally settle the question of the FCC's authority over retail Internet service. If Chairman Wheeler moves ahead as planned, however, the only certainty is that the FCC will again find itself tangled up in court for years to come. Before I finish my remarks, I want to put forward a challenge to the members of this committee. Let's find common ground and forge a permanent solution. I've offered the President an opportunity to engage. I've spoken with Chairman Wheeler on numerous occasions, and I will engage any senator who wants to find a workable legislative solution. Having the FCC regulate the internet as a public utility while Congress sits idly on the sideline is an outcome that will prove to be short-sighted. Let's find a consensus solution that none of us have to call a compromise. I look forward to hearing from our diverse panel of experts today and also to working with my colleagues in the coming days and weeks. With that, I yield to my distinguished ranking member, the Senator from Florida, Senator Nelson.
Mr. Chairman, indeed it has been a pleasure working with you as we have been having discussions on this issue and many others over the past several months. And there will be many areas that we will be able to carry forth this bipartisan tradition. The interest in this particular topic is evident by the line still waiting outside of the door to get in. I thank you for calling this hearing. And as we said in the organizational meeting yesterday, I look forward of continuing the work with you in this committee's proud tradition of working in a bipartisan fashion. The internet has become an essential part of our everyday lives. You'll be hearing a lot more about national security and the place that the internet plays and the cybersecurity. Many of us are almost constantly connected to the internet at school, at work, or at play. Computers, tablets, and smartphones are certainly within arm's reach and in most of our pockets. Access to broadband research and the broadband internet service is no longer a luxury item. It's a basic service that provides a vital link to our friends and our family and the rest of society. And because it's an integral part of how we live today, there is broad agreement today among consumers in many parts of the industry and in Congress that we have to protect a free and open internet. That was not always the case. For years, we heard from some that net neutrality, quote, was a solution in search of a problem, end of quote. Well, I'm glad that we've moved beyond that tired talking point and are here today to discuss how we can best preserve a free and open internet. That is an essential step, and I fully appreciate how far many of our colleagues have come on this issue in a very short time. And one indication of that is over 4 million Americans have taken the time to weigh in directly with the FCC to express their desire for strong net neutrality protections. They do not want their access to websites and services blocked. They want to know more about their internet service and the overall performance of the connection. And they are certainly worried about their broadband provider picking winners and losers on the internet by regulating those content companies who refuse to pay a toll to a slow lane of service. So as the chairman and I have been talking about these issues for some time, I want to continue those discussions. But I want to be clear about what is important to this senator. And I believe it is to most of the consumers. First, we need to be vigilant in protecting consumers' interest. Theirs is the lens through which we must see any proposal on net neutrality, the consumer's interest. And second, while I appreciate and respect the desire by businesses for certainty of their investment and their operation, and that is a legitimate concern that we want to help protect, I remain concerned about any proposal that would strip away the FCC's tools to enforce essential consumer protections for broadband service. The internet is evolving at a blistering pace. The internet that we know today likely will be vastly different a decade from now. Take, for example, when we started the space program, when we put up John Glenn, we did not even know if the eyeballs were going to stay in the eye sockets. And now we are at a point that we are seriously discussing, and the president said last night, we're sending humans to Mars. That's the goal. Things evolve. Things change at a blistering pace, and the internet is one of them. In this ever-evolving internet, this senator believes that we need a regulator who is not frozen in time. And the FCC must have the authority that is flexible enough that it can respond to a changing world. If we put a straitjacket on the commission, we may very well miss the future and leave the agency powerless and American consumers defenseless to deal with the emerging problems. For over 80 years, Congress has tasked the FCC with preventing unjust practices, stopping unreasonable discrimination, protecting competition, and promoting the public interest. These are not mere abstract ideals. And so without this flexible authority, the FCC could not have successfully extended universal service funding to broadband or to ensure the privacy of sensitive consumer information. These laws and principles have made the U.S. telecommunications market the envy of the world, and they should not be discarded. And so finally, some maintain that we must have congressional action on net neutrality prior to the FCC action. I do not share that idea. It is more important to get the issue right than it is to get it done right now. The stakes are too high. The consumers' interests are at stake. The future of the internet is at stake. The congressional prerogative to act does not cease merely because an agency has moved forward and done its job. And similarly, an agency is not always required to cease its reasoned consideration of an issue merely because Congress may be examining the same concern at the same time of which we have that legitimate authority and responsibility to do. And to that end, this senator welcomes the FCC's efforts to put in place necessary consumer protections for the internet. I look forward to reviewing the particulars of the chairman of the FCC's proposal next month. I want to thank the witnesses today for appearing, and I look forward to hearing your testimony.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. We have a very distinguished and impressive group of panelists today to speak to this issue, and I'm going to introduce each of them, and then we'll start left to right with Ms. Baker. But Honorable Meredith Attwell Baker is President and CEO of CTIA, which is the Wireless Association here in Washington, D.C. Mr. Gene Kimmelman, President and CEO of Public Knowledge. The Honorable Robert McDowell, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute. Mr. Paul Misener, Vice President of Global Public Policy at Amazon.com. Mr. Tom Simmons, Senior Vice President of Public Policy at Midcontinent Communications from my home state of South Dakota. And Dr. Nicol Turner-Lee, Vice President and Chief Research and Policy Officer, Multicultural Media and Telecommunications Council, here in Washington, D.C. Thank you all for being here, and we'll start on my left and your right. Ms. Baker.
All right. Chairman Thune, Ranking Member Nelson, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to share the wireless industry's perspective on the importance of an open internet. At the outset, I want to be clear. America's wireless industry supports an open internet. Wireless users demand it in a marketplace where competition has never been more vigorous. In the past 20 years, the wireless industry has grown from a luxury product to a key driver of economic growth. We all benefit from faster speeds, more services, and lower prices. The U.S. is the global leader in wireless by almost any metric and is at the forefront of mobile innovation in health, automotive, and payment fields. Central to that growth was Congress's foresight in establishing Section 332 and a mobile-specific regulatory framework outside of Title II. Congress has the opportunity to provide the same stability for broadband. We greatly appreciate this committee's work to develop a regulatory foundation for future innovation with common-sense net neutrality provisions. The draft bill is an excellent start and offers a viable path to preserve an open internet with enforceable requirements. Properly crafted legislation will guarantee the protections the President has called for, while allowing broadband providers to continue to invest billions, create jobs, and develop innovative products. We do not ask that wireless be exempt from any new laws, only that the new requirements reflect our industry, our technology, and our inherent differences. I want to highlight 3 key differences. First, mobile services are technically different and depend upon limited spectrum resources. This requires substantial network management, millisecond by millisecond, to deliver service to consumers. Remarkably, there is more bandwidth in a single strand of fiber than in all of the spectrum allocated for commercial mobile services. Second, we are competitively different. More than 8 out of 10 Americans can choose from 4 or more broadband providers. This fierce competition is driving new services, offerings, and differentiation that benefits consumers. Third, we are evolutionarily different. 4G networks are less than 5 years old. The future is bright with advancements like LTE broadcast, 5G services, and connected life applications. It is vital that any legislation is sufficiently flexible to preserve the competition, differentiation, and innovation mobile consumers enjoy today. While we are optimistic that the process on the Hill will enhance the wireless experience for all Americans, we have significant reservations with the FCC's proposed path of Title II. The application of Title II in any form to wireless broadband would harm consumers in our economy. Title II was designed for another technology in another era in which competition was largely non-existent and innovation came slowly, if at all. Given our industry's great success with mobile broadband outside of Title II, we have significant concerns with how Title II and its 682 pages of regulation would apply to the dynamic mobile broadband space. If the Commission proceeds with Title II, as opposed to the Section 706 path the Court contemplated a year ago, the wireless industry will have no choice but to look to the courts. Given the clear language of Section 332, we have every confidence that we would prevail, but it is not our preferred course. Under Section 332, mobile broadband is legally different too. In 1993, Congress exempted future non-voice mobile services like mobile broadband from common carriage regulation. It did so unambiguously. The Commission and the courts have repeatedly found that wireless broadband is not a common carriage service. The FCC lacks the statutory authority to change course, and litigation would harm consumers with a year or more of uncertainty and delay. As leaders across the globe are trying to replicate our mobile success and embrace 5G, this is the wrong time to inject uncertainty and delay into our nation's efforts. We risk falling behind when the stakes have never been higher for our connected life and global competitiveness. The better approach would be for Congress to act and end this debate. Doing so would free us to turn to pressing bipartisan issues like spectrum reform and COM Act modernization. By acting, Congress can ensure that the United States remains the most dynamic and innovative mobile ecosystem. Thank you for the opportunity to appear on today's panel, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On behalf of Public Knowledge, a nonprofit that promotes creativity, freedom of expression, an affordable and open internet and communications platforms, I really appreciate the opportunity to testify today. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to start by congratulating you on ascending to the throne of this committee. Your staff has been wonderful in reaching out and debating issues and engaging with us, and we really look forward to working with you in the coming years. And of course, I can only say the same, Senator Nelson, for you and your wonderful staff. It's a pleasure working with you. It's really quite a pleasure to see bipartisan statements on this committee about the importance of many of the critical principles that are necessary for an open internet. It's really an important bipartisan step that I applaud you for. But I must also say that we are extremely pleased to see the FCC moving forward with strong net neutrality rules to preserve an open internet and to address what millions of consumers, small businesses, innovators, civil rights organizations have been asking for, and that is preserving freedom on the internet and ensuring adequate tools for policing that to promote freedom of expression on that important platform of communications. We really appreciate your desire in Congress to review all the important policies that govern communications and look forward to working with you on that. However, I must urge caution in this area. In more than 3 decades of work with the Congress and communications regulators, the expert agency, it's very important that whatever you do not interfere with rules that the agency appropriately can promulgate or legislate in a manner that could cause more harm than good. Now, what do I mean by that? My experience is that Congress is really great, really wonderful, and has accomplished a lot when it's establishing principles and goals for communications and many other policy areas. That's what you do best. That's what has worked in the past. And then delegating authority to an expert agency to work out all the details and manage the rules of the road. And in this space, what that has done is enabled us to go from landline services to wireless services, from broadcast to cable, from traditional telecom to broadband services. But given the tremendous dynamism in this area as well, the technology changing so fast, it's also important to make sure that we are preparing for what is the next generation of offerings for consumers. We're looking forward and not just backwards. It's extremely dangerous, I believe, for the Congress to step in and try to micromanage what is best left to an expert agency. Now, what might I mean here? In this draft legislation, you address a number of important areas, blocking, paid prioritization, but general non-discrimination that is harmful to competition and freedom of expression. What about that? What might the next generation of that be? Caps on services, usage caps? Some kind of new fast lanes that are based on quality, not speed? Some kind of preferential arrangement for a Comcast, an AT&T, or Verizon for its own affiliated services. I don't know what those might be, but it's absolutely critical that we not need to come back to Congress every time we worry about discrimination, but that an expert agency has the authority to deal with that. In legislating, you need to not just worry about this dynamism. Keep in mind that these are companies, wonderful companies, that have been found by the courts following agency action to have an incentive and an opportunity to discriminate. Why? Not because they're bad, but because that's profit maximization for these companies. And it's with that incentive that we need a policeman, in this case the FCC, to monitor what they do. So we need the FCC to be able to exercise all of its authority, use all of its tools that are necessary to address these dangers. And we believe that requires Title II, which it does not appear the draft legislation contemplates. And if you are serious about legislating, we also urge you to look at the tried and true tools that have protected consumers in so many ways, whether it's their privacy or the rights of the disabled, or extending services to rural America, or providing subsidies for low-income people who couldn't afford essential services. We need to make sure those tools are available as well in the broadband era for these services. Unfortunately, again, it does not appear the draft legislation provides those tools for the FCC. So, in conclusion, I urge you, as you consider evaluating what the FCC does, to let them go, do what you do best, monitor them, step in if they have done it inappropriately, and consider all the forward-looking needs that we have for consumers in the broadband era. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Nelson and all the distinguished members of the committee. It's really an honor to be back here before you again. I am a partner at Wiley Ryan and a senior fellow of the Hudson Institute's Center for Economics of the Internet. Nonetheless, I'm not testifying today on behalf of any client of Wiley Ryan or on behalf of the Hudson Institute, and the opinions I express today are purely my own. From my perspective, by the way, I think it is quite appropriate for your first hearing of the new Congress to be focused on the future of the Internet. I've always supported the goals of an open Internet that maximizes freedom, and that is precisely what the private sector built as the Internet migrated further away from government control. We are here today, however, because the FCC is on the brink of applying an antiquated but powerful 80-year-old law to the dynamic and ever-evolving Internet. Title II of the Communications Act of 1934 was designed in an era when people held their phones with two hands. While I was a commissioner, I kept my grandmother's 1950s black rotary dial phone from San Angelo, Texas, on my desk to remind me of the lack of innovation and investment produced by Title II. On her birthday, you all may remember this, we kids would stay up past 11 p.m. to call her because the heavy-handed regulatory capture of Title II produced artificially high long-distance rates, which came down just a little bit late at night. The FCC's chairman, a friend of mine, maintains that the so-called just and reasonable standard of sections 201 and 202 will be good policy for America's world-leading internet economy. He and I are both students of history, so let's allow history to be our guide to test that premise. Since President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Title II into law, the principles underpinning sections 201 and 202 have been litigated in federal appellate courts nearly 400 times, with the last decision being rendered as recently as 2012. That equates to an average of 5 court cases per year since Title II became law. And those are only cases that involve the just and reasonable standard and not other aspects of Title II, which my friend Gene Kimmelman has suggested also be included in new FCC rules. Similarly, within the FCC itself, the just and reasonable standard has been litigated in administrative proceedings 1,069 times. That equates to more than 13 cases per year since the inception of Title II. In short, just and reasonable is perhaps the most litigated term in telecommunications jurisprudence. Applying it to the Internet would create a billable hours bonanza for telecom lawyers. So really, I should be all for this. But is this what we want America's 21st century tech policy to look like? To put a finer point on it, do we want the robust Internet economy to be shaped by engineers, consumers, and entrepreneurs, or lawyers? Today, policymakers have a choice in front of them, a sharp choice. Do they want to protect an open Internet, or do they want broader government engineering of the Internet ecosphere? The draft bill, although imperfect, attains the ostensible policy goals net neutrality proponents have advocated for years by essentially restating existing law, but allowing the FCC to enforce it. For instance, the bill prohibits anti-competitive throttling and paid prioritization. It also mandates transparency for consumers and much more. These are also the goals outlined by President Obama in his directive to the FCC of November the 10th. Logically, then, net neutrality proponents should be happy with the goals of the draft. But some want more than their stated goals. They want Title II and the power that comes with it. But make no mistake, Title II would drag America's tech sector under its purview. The Supreme Court said as much when it held in 2005 that reclassification of broadband internet under Title II, quote, would subject to mandatory common carrier regulation all information service providers that use telecommunications as an input to provide information services to the public, end quote. Translated, if you think you're merely a content or application provider or a tech company, after Title II reclassification, you could be eventually regulated like an old-fashioned phone company. This is especially true as tech and telecom companies continue to morph to look like one another. And FCC attempts to refrain or forbear from the vast majority of Title II's 1,000 or so requirements will likely fail an appeal because any reasons given to justify sweeping forbearance logically undercut the reasons for applying Title II to begin with. In other words, Title II classification and massive forbearance contradict each other. Although I continue to advocate for a comprehensive rewrite of our communications laws to focus more on consumer protection, as Senator Nelson pointed out, rather than outdated technology-centric approaches, the draft in front of the Senate today provides all sides of this debate with the opportunity to declare victory. The last question is, will they? Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. McDowell. Mr. Misener.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Nelson. I really appreciate the opportunity to testify today. Thank you for your attention to this great, very important topic. I will be focusing on your draft bill. Amazon has long supported maintaining the fundamental openness of the Internet, which has been so beneficial to consumers and innovation. Now, there is widespread acceptance for the need for government action to ensure that Internet openness. Now, policymakers need only to decide how to ensure that the Internet openness of net neutrality is maintained and effective. At Amazon, our consistent business practice is to start with customers and work backwards. That is, we begin projects by determining what customers want and how we can innovate for them. Here, in the context of net neutrality public policy, we have done the same. We take our position from our customers, that is, consumers' point of view. Consumers want to keep the fundamental openness of the Internet and the choice it provides. Consumers will recognize if net neutrality is taken from them. And if net neutrality is taken, they won't care how, or, for example, where in the network infrastructure it is taken. We believe that the FCC has ample existing authority to maintain net neutrality. But obviously, Congress has the power to set new policies for net neutrality, either entirely through a new statute or through a mix of new and existing statute. Amazon remains very grateful for Congress's continuing attention to net neutrality. The topic certainly is worth your vigilant oversight. Thank you also, Mr. Chairman, for creating and sharing your discussion draft bill and for providing me the opportunity to begin discussing it today. The principles of net neutrality contained in the discussion draft are excellent. For example, the draft clearly acknowledges that throttling and paid prioritization must be banned, that net neutrality protections must apply to wireless as well as to wireline, and that providers must disclose their practices. Of course, for these excellent principles of Internet openness to be meaningful to consumers, they need to be effective. In at least 3 instances, however, the discussion draft could be interpreted to undermine that effectiveness, so that the bill should be modified accordingly. First, in subsection D, while requiring consumer choice, the bill would explicitly exempt specialized services from that requirement. This could create a huge loophole if, for example, specialized services involve the prioritization of some content and services, just like prescribed paid prioritization. Consumer choice is baked into the Internet. Nothing would protect consumer choice more than protecting the open Internet from interference by broadband Internet access providers. Second, in subsection F, the discussion draft would permit broadband Internet access providers to engage in, quote, reasonable network management. But any claim of reasonable network management should be viewed suspiciously if, in practice, it undermines prohibitions of blocking, throttling, and paid prioritization, etc. Third, the discussion draft is unclear or silent on an important point of clarification. Which part of a broadband internet access service provider's network are covered by the net neutrality protections. As indicated earlier, a consumer will not care where in her service provider's network any interference occurs, only whether it occurs. In sum, these three areas of the discussion draft should be modified in order to ensure that the internet openness of net neutrality is maintained and effective. In addition, the discussion draft should be modified to provide adequate legal detail and certainty to consumers and businesses in the internet ecosystem. Like all businesses, internet companies need confidence in the state of law and regulation in order to innovate and invest in products and services on behalf of their customers. Details, including the factors that would be considered during formal complaint procedures, are essential for businesses and consumers to have the confidence to make informed choices about investments and purchases. We believe that the FCC should be empowered to create adequate legal certainty and detail through effective enforcement tools and notice and comment rulemaking, but the discussion draft bill would limit the FCC in several ways. Subsection B says that the FCC may not expand internet openness obligations beyond the obligations established in the bill. If the intention here is to establish a ceiling for these obligations, this is Congress's prerogative for sure, and we would support a provision like this if the bill went only so far. However, with such a ceiling in place, it is not necessary to rescind the FCC's authority under Title II of the Communications Act, as in subsection E, which could leave the agency helpless to address improper behaviors well within its authority below the ceiling, and would leave consumers and businesses in the internet ecosystem without adequate certainty about FCC's enforcement powers. Also, because subsection B could be interpreted to bar the FCC from notice and comment rulemaking in this area, if that's the intent, we would oppose it. Directing the FCC not to expand statutorily established obligations is one thing, but we would believe it would be a mistake to prohibit the Commission from providing, through notice and comment rulemaking, adequate legal detail and certainty to consumers and businesses. So in conclusion, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to working with you and the committee and the FCC to ensure that the internet openness of net neutrality is maintained and effective, and I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Misener. Mr. Simmons.
Chairman Thune, Ranking Member Nelson, members of the committee, thank you so much for inviting me here today to discuss how Congress can update our internet laws to ensure vigorous broadband investment and an open internet for the future. My name is Tom Simmons. I'm the Senior Vice President of Public Policy for Midcontinent Communications. Midcontinent is the leading provider of cable television, telephone, high-speed internet access, cable advertising services in North Dakota, South Dakota, and Minnesota. Our communities vary in size from densities of 5 to 116 homes per mile of cable plant, and their population ranges from less than 125 in Dodge, North Dakota, to more than 160,000 in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Our mission is to ensure that the rural communities we serve are at the leading edge of technology. The FCC's decision a decade ago to regulate internet service only lightly encouraged Midcontinent to invest nearly $400 million in our networks over the past 10 years. We recently doubled our customers' download speeds, and just this past November, we unveiled our new Gigabit initiative, which will make gigabit internet speeds available that are 5 times faster than our current best, and about 35 times faster than the average high-speed internet access speed in the country today. Once complete, gigabit internet access will be available to the majority of our customers, including those in some of our most rural areas of the country. And we're not alone in our investment. Since 1996, ISPs have invested $1.3 trillion in their broadband networks. Last year, ISPs invested more in America than any other non-financial sector. Today, more than 85% of U.S. homes have access to networks that can achieve 100 megabit speeds or faster. The overall internet economy in the U.S. supports 869,000 jobs. In 2014 alone, Midcontinent's customers' bandwidth usage increased by 77%, and bandwidth consumption is doubling for us every 15 months. Midcontinent has a tremendous business incentive to invest, but not if we're subjected to regulation that limits our ability to innovate. Midcontinent supports the draft legislation. It would establish basic principles of internet fairness and set this country on a path to regulatory certainty and stability. It would ensure that broadband customers can enjoy unconstrained use of the service they pay for, that the FCC can protect consumers, that internet-based businesses can invest without concern that an ISP can interfere with their access to customers, and that ISPs can develop their service freely. And it would accomplish all these goals without dragging the provision of internet service back to the monopoly telephone era. Many of the draft's obligations reflect our existing business practices. Every Internet user should be able to access any lawful content, service, or application they choose. Purposely throttling customers would directly interfere with our business strategy of offering the fastest possible broadband speeds. And no ISP has adopted a strategy of paid prioritization, even in the absence of rules. The draft legislation also wisely protects the needs for network management. ISPs need to utilize reasonable network management practices to ensure customers are getting the maximum benefits of their broadband service and to protect consumers against harmful cyber intrusion. The draft legislation's transparency principles strike an appropriate balance between consumers' need for and the right to clear and easy to understand information about their broadband service and the need to ensure that in the name of transparency, potential wrongdoers do not have a roadmap to the best means of thwarting safeguards that we put in place to protect the network. While we can support well-crafted regulations, we're adamantly opposed to the imposition of an outdated common carrier regulatory regime. Imposing Title II regulations would work against the government's policy goals of increasing broadband deployment and adoption. The regulatory burdens and costs associated with the Title II approach would have a significant and disproportionate impact on our ability to invest further in our broadband networks. Title II proponents often point to the FCC's forbearance authority, which is intended to allow the FCC to alleviate some of Title II's regulatory burdens as a simple solution to our concerns. But in reality, those same Title II proponents are pressing the FCC not to forbear from vast swaths of Title II now that they think the reclassification decision might be going their way. While it seems clear that applying Title II regulatory framework to broadband Internet access will only interfere with the dynamic Internet, the FCC is poised to take just that step. Truly, there's a better way, and the proposed legislation is an important part of finding the right path forward. Therefore, I urge the committee to move forward with a bipartisan draft so that Midcontinent and others can continue to ensure that all Americans, including those in rural America, receive the full potential of America's broadband networks. Thank you so much again for inviting me to be here today, and we look forward to working with you on these very important measures.
Thank you, Mr. Simmons. Dr. Turner-Lee.
I'm a little short, so I have to pull up a little bit. Chairman Thune, Ranking Member Nelson, and distinguished members of the committee, I am honored to appear before the committee to address this nation's efforts to preserve the open Internet, particularly as it concerns communities of color and other more vulnerable populations. And I have to say, to keep my job as Vice President and Chief Research and Policy Officer, we changed our name today. And so for the record, we just became the Multicultural Media, Telecom, and Internet Council after 28 years. And for those of you that are less familiar with MMTC, what we primarily do is work to preserve and expand opportunity, equal access, and ownership among people of color, particularly minority and women business enterprises. And we proudly partner with groups that consist of the National Urban League, LULAC, AAJC, Rainbow Push Coalition, among others, to actually advance that mission. And our groups have been intricately involved with this issue for quite some time. We've been actively engaged in the debate as historically disadvantaged communities embark on a journey towards first-class digital citizenship and all of its opportunities. So today we applaud the draft legislation addressing the president's values as a starting point for further discussion. And I'd like to bring to the attention 3 issues, and my statement is on record in much more detail, but my time is best spent on these points. I'd first like to highlight the unique benefits that the open Internet brings to people of color in vulnerable populations and encourage the committee's consideration of legislation that promotes an open Internet. And finally, in my testimony, I'd like to offer 2 friendly recommendations of legislation to the legislation that will promote the open Internet while at the same time ensuring consumer protections. Let me start by saying that broadband access, adoption, and digital literacy are civil rights prerequisites. Broadband allows all Americans to gain new skills, secure good jobs, attain a quality education, and receive greater access to health care. Today, however, too many Americans still do not benefit from all that broadband enables. The rate of broadband adoption among vulnerable populations is disproportionately low, contributing to a persistent digital divide. Despite growth in minority home broadband adoption, rates among African Americans and Hispanics are still lower than whites. African Americans over the age of 65, for example, still exhibit especially low rates. 45% of African American seniors are Internet users, and only 30% have broadband at home, compared to 63% and 51% respectively for white seniors. Non-users overall cite a perceived lack of relevance, affordability, and the lack of a device in that order as their prime reasons for not being online. So closing the digital divide should and must be an important goal for policymakers, and steering the right course of action to promote and protect an open internet is one way for us to get there. Now, Congress has had a proud history of recognizing structural injustices in our society and acting to correct them. In the 1860s, Congress framed and passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which ended slavery, extended equal protection, and enfranchised millions of Americans for the first time. In the 60s, Congress enacted the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968, all due in great measure to a great man whose birthday we just celebrated. And today, Congress has the opportunity to show that leadership yet again. By enacting a legislative solution that preserves the open internet we all have come to enjoy, Congress can extend the promise of justice, equality, and democracy for all, and avoid a legal quagmire that will lead to the unending uncertainty for our economy and citizens. An open internet stimulates demand for broadband, which in turn stimulates investment in infrastructure and innovation, all too important to multicultural communities and vulnerable populations. It is our belief at MMTC increased investment in broadband also improves access, adoption, and the types of innovations that we'd like to drive in our communities, including telehealth, distance learning, and open government. For the past 20 years, the FCC chairs from both political parties, administration have charted a successful regulatory paradigm for the internet, and communities of color have benefited from that. Although overall broadband adoption by people of color has lagged, for example, certain categories have not. Nearly 75% of African Americans and 70% of Hispanic cell phone owners use their device to access the internet more than the overall population. And people of color have embraced broadband as a tool of empowerment, as evident under the current rules in places like Ferguson, Missouri, New York City, and Columbus, Ohio. These stats should tell us that we need to continue this progress. But unfortunately, recent efforts by the FCC to enact meaningful open internet rules have failed. Last year, the D.C. Circuit Court struck down key portions of the Commission's open internet order. Now, notwithstanding the current regulatory framework that has allowed broadband to flourish and take hold, the FCC is considering the imposition of Title II regulation, which we at MMTC believe is ill-suited to the current realities. Imposing such heavy-handed framework on the internet would only serve to stifle broadband deployment, discourage investment, and harm innovation. It would also place uncertainty for consumers through regressive taxation and on universal service and potential ambiguity on consumer enforcements. Some have argued that the FCC could reduce the adverse effects of Title II regulation through judicious applications of forbearance authority. We think that suggestion misses the point. Even if the Commission could exercise its forbearance authority in a productive manner, it would take years to sort out an appropriately calibrated set of rules. And meanwhile, this regulatory uncertainty harms communities of color for the reasons I've already mentioned. The bottom line is that even if the Commission were to forbear, delay would stifle the progress we have seen in connecting communities of color and put us behind on the discussion of areas that matter the most to us: universal service, ensuring public safety, as well as digital redlining. I'd like to just close just really quickly with two additional amendments that we think could actually enhance this. First, as Congress considers the bill, Congress should address the harmful practice of digital redlining. Digital redlining is a refusal to build and serve lower-income communities on the same terms as wealthier communities. It imposes, in essence, digital segregation. Sadly, as the experience of this country shows, segregation harms and degrades all, and we cannot bring that into the digital age. Congress should empower the FCC to prohibit digital redlining and therefore ensure equal access for all, and that could be considered under the FCC's current 706 authority. Second, we think to enhance the consumer protections in the bill, perhaps there is a way to suggest something that we actually put into record, which is the creation of an accessible, affordable, and expedited procedure for the reporting and resolution of complaints. Modeled after the probable cause paradigm in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we feel that this precise details of that structure could be applied to the communication ecosystem and therefore allow people to get their complaints heard without feeling like they have to have a lawyer. So in closing, the time is now to get past the morass of a debate that's been lingering for more than a decade. And with Congress's discussion and guidance on the issue, I think we can make it happen. So we offer those, and I welcome any questions, and we're here to help in the crafting of this legislation.
Thank you, Dr. Turner-Lee. We've got a lot of participation here today from senators, and so I'm going to confine it to 5-minute rounds and run a pretty tight gavel on that. So if somebody's answering a question, we won't interrupt you, but try and, if you can, adhere to that. Mr. Simmons, would subjecting broadband services to Title II regulations make it more or less costly for Midco to offer and expand broadband services, and would it make it more or less costly for Midco subscribers to purchase broadband services?
Senator, thank you. I believe it would increase our cost of operation. If we were to adhere or respond to all the requirements of Title II, it would place a great burden on us in just the reporting structures alone. And some of the unintended consequences perhaps buried within all that may not be obvious to some, but a cost of operation for pole attachments, for instance. We would be now paying a substantially higher fee than we would under the classification as an information service. And for us in our very rural areas, it's very significant. There's a lot of miles of wide open prairie from small town to small town that we have to interconnect. So I'm going to guess that our cost would probably be a whole lot higher than it might be in a more densely populated area. There are some parts of our country where we can't even go underground. It must be all above ground. I'm speaking specifically of the Black Hills of South Dakota, for example. Hard for us to tunnel through granite. So it would increase our costs there. And those costs ultimately would be passed on to our customers. The real burden for us, other than increasing costs, which we never want to do unnecessarily to any of our customers, is that we'd have to explain to them how their costs were going up with no appreciable increase in value to them. We might get away for a short time by saying it's the government and we can't do anything about it, but it tends to reduce the level of trust that they might have in us. And we're very, very sensitive to our customers' demands and work very hard to satisfy them, not only in the quality of the services that we're able to provide, but also in the price that we expect them to pay for it. So, Senator, it would have a great impact on our company.
Thank you. Mr. McDowell, following potential Title II reclassification and with Section 706 authority at its disposal, what would be the limits of the FCC's authority to regulate broadband internet service or the entire internet for that matter?
Under Title II?
Under Section 706, with Title II reclassification and Section 706 authority.
So Section 706, according to the D.C. Circuit a year ago, almost exactly, would allow the Commission to adopt rules that accomplish all the ostensible goals outlined by Chairman Wheeler and President Obama on November the 10th.
Mr. Misener, in your testimony, you stated that Amazon, and I quote, certainly doesn't support allowing an agency to act beyond its statutory authority. Do you agree with Mr. McDowell, and so do you support Congress establishing limits on the FCC's authority?
Well, certainly it's Congress's prerogative, Senator, to establish those limits, and we would support Congress pursuing that avenue. Of course, there is existing statute under which the FCC may and should operate, and Chairman Wheeler should be applauded for the work he's done with his existing statute. But if there were additional statutory direction given by Congress, we certainly would welcome that.
As follow-up to that, the Internet Association, which lobbies on Amazon's behalf, recently sent a letter to the FCC stating that just 3 of Title II's 48 sections appear adequate to meet open Internet goals, namely Sections 201, 202, and 203. Would you support, to follow up to the previous question, Congress prohibiting the FCC from applying the 45 unnecessary sections of Title II to the Internet, including retail rate regulation?
Senator, you raise a terrific point. Title II is not binary. My friend Mr. McDowell has talked about the harms that Title II could create, and I share his view. And so we do believe that Sections 201, 202, and 208 would be adequate to protect net neutrality, which has been our focus both at Amazon and the Internet Association.
Mr. Kimmelman, if the FCC intends with its forthcoming rule to forbear from all those parts of Title II that are, quote, less relevant to the broadband services, as the President has said in his advocating those efforts, would you support Congress statutorily prohibiting the FCC from applying those parts of Title II to broadband services in the future?
Mr. Chairman, I think it would depend exactly what you're talking about. I think if of 48 sections, there are only a handful that could be relevant as far as I can imagine looking forward or looking at it today. It's more than Mr. Misener's 3, but not a lot more. I think the real question is it appropriate at this time, and you should look at it, to just wipe those out completely for the future. If it's something that's a reporting requirement, that, like Mr. Simmons is talking about, it may have nothing to do with what we care about in broadband. But if it matters to promoting build-out, if it matters to making the service affordable, if it matters to basic privacy protections, if it matters to promoting more competition so that we get multiple carriers, I would hope you'd want to preserve that authority somewhere in the expert agencies so they could adjust to technology and market conditions.
Time's expired. Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Baker, I have a letter from one of your largest member companies, from Sprint, and Mr. Chairman, I would ask consent that it be entered as part of the record.
Without objection.
And I quote from the first paragraph, Sprint does not believe that a light touch application of Title II, including appropriate forbearance, would harm the continued investment in and deployment of mobile broadband services. How does that square, Ms. Baker, with your testimony?
Thank you, Senator. So what we know is that the current framework is working. In the past 4 years, we've invested $121 billion in infrastructure. We will still invest. There's no doubt about that. But because if you, in this industry, if you miss an innovation cycle, you risk being obsolete. The question is how much. And mobile broadband has never been under Title II. So it's an unknown. I would bring to your attention what happened in Europe. Europe was the leader in 3G, and then they overregulated. And between 2011 and 2014, in the United States, we had 73% more investment in CapEx. Our networks are 30 times faster than in Europe, and we have 3 times more subscribers in LTE. So it's a real-world comparison that's clear that if there's more regulation, there's less investment. I would call attention to a second filing that Sprint made last week. The first one received an awful lot of attention. The second one was talking about how mobile is different and needs to be regulated differently, and it's both not only the technical components but also the competitive marketplace of the mobile ecosystem.
You do not disagree with the position taken by Sprint in the letter?
Investment will happen. The question is how much.
Okay. Well, let me ask you about this. Several senior executives from several of your companies have told Wall Street that reclassification would have no impact on network investment. Can you reconcile those statements?
Well, mobile broadband has never been under Title II. And when Congress deregulated wireless in 1993, it was very clear in the language that it used. It decided that mobile voice was a CMRS, and it put it in one bucket, and it said it was going to use limited Title II requirements, and it put mobile broadband under PMRS, and it said, Congress explicitly said that it was exempt from Title II requirements. So the FCC can't just disregard what Congress told them they had to do and reclassify as a Title II requirement.
Mr. Kimmelman, you want to comment?
Thank you, Senator Nelson. I respectfully disagree with Ms. Baker's legal analysis. I think Congress left that authority to the FCC, and I think it's within the FCC's authority to do that. And I would just point out, the logic of this is real simple. You all have one of these probably. If you pick it up and make a phone call, it's under general non-discrimination requirements as defined by the law. Now, if you want to go and look for a map, or you're looking for a restaurant, or you're editing a document, is that a private service as compared to a commercial service? That's what the FCC is grappling with. We believe they have the authority to do it under the authority that you had given them. And logically, it makes no sense to differentiate those at this point in time.
Can I respond to that?
Can I respond to that too?
The way that Congress described it actually was very specific. It said if it touched the PSTN, the public network, the telephone network system, then it would, in fact, be new future broadband services. So it's very clear how Congress defined what future mobile services would be. And just because you can watch a broadcast on your telephone doesn't make a broadcaster a telephone, a broadcaster, just because you can make a payment on a phone. You don't define it by the services that ride upon it. You define it by what the service is.
And the FCC agreed in the data roaming order in 2011.
So what was wildly successful with regard to the wireless industry, are you saying that that can't be applied to broadband? The regulatory approach.
The regulatory of
Why
wireless.
couldn't that same model work for broadband?
Congress set the regulatory regime. The FCC can't decide what they want to do with it. The Congress has set out what the regulatory regime is for wireless. And I appreciate that you think it's wildly successful. We do too, and we just want to make sure that it stays that way. The regulatory is split. It's for mobile voice one way and for new services such as mobile broadband another way.
Mr. Kimmelman?
What's widely successful has been the wireless industry overall, which includes the portion that Ms. Baker indicated is subject to broader non-discrimination requirements. So I believe it's a matter of what is logical and what does the FCC have the authority to do. We clearly disagree on the legal issue, but I think as a policy matter, do you want to treat the broadband portion of your wireless service differently than you're just plain old phone calling on the wireless? It doesn't make sense to me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. I have, in this order, Senators Blunt, Klobuchar, Moran, and then Markey. There. Senator Blunt.
Thank you, Chairman. So on that, I think pursuing that same line, Mr. McDowell, I think the FCC a number of times in 2003, 5, 7, maybe 11, but at least 3, 5, and 7 said that it didn't have the authority to do this because it classified broadband as an information service. Is that correct?
It didn't say it didn't have the authority in certain technologies. For instance, DSL could have, perhaps the Supreme Court said in 2005 in Brand X that it could have at that point, but things have changed. So wireless is different. Section 332, as my former colleague, Commissioner Baker, just pointed out, is very clear, actually, and it's what Congress did in 1993, I believe. So Congress has spoken. The FCC can't legislate on this point. Only Congress can, and that's why it's very appropriate for this committee to be considering legislation.
And Ms. Baker, your point was that since Congress has said this is an information service, by using it in a different way doesn't change the definition of the service?
Correct.
And when Congress said that, was that specifically intended to define whether Title II or other would apply or not?
I'm sorry, Senator. It was at the beginning. It was at the emergence of the wireless industry, and they said the voice looks like voice and covers the PSTN and whatever new services. We want to make sure that they flourish and are successful, which I think Congress got it right. Mobile broadband has been extremely successful, and I think we look forward to the next success in a connected life of mobile health and connected cars and mobile payments.
And did, in your testimony, did you mention the amount of investment?
The wireless industry has invested $121 billion over the last 4 years. So I think the system is clearly working. We are the leader in the world by any metric, basically, almost. And we want to take our leadership in 4G and make sure that we lead in the next generation of networks, 5G.
So you served on the FCC. Was there ever a complaint at the time, a formal complaint filed since the adoption of the 2010 open rule?
No.
You don't recall?
No, there weren't. No, ever.
So I know that Senator Nelson said that we wouldn't wear out the idea of a solution in search of a problem. If there's no complaint, what are we trying to solve here?
I think we're here, Senator, because the FCC is proposing Title II, and that is so toxic to the internet ecosphere, not just network operators like wireless companies or cable companies or phone companies, but content and application providers that have their own networks, their own fiber, thousands of miles of fiber and routers, caching content and intelligence close to end users so consumers can get that data, that content more quickly. They, according to the Supreme Court, which I quoted in my testimony, could be captured by Title II classification. That's what I think they don't understand. And the proponents of net neutrality, as my friend Gene pointed out, they want more than 201 and 202. They want other aspects of Title II in there. And I think that's what this is all about. So if the ostensible goals, if the real goals is they've been promoted for 10 years, and I was at the commission for 7 of those 10 years, if they really just want to protect consumers, then what this committee could do, what Congress could do, is restate some existing law like the Federal Trade Commission Act, essentially, and give the FCC some enforcement powers there. But also classifying broadband internet access as a Title II telecom service takes away the Federal Trade Commission's authority under the common carrier exemption. So there are a lot of unintended consequences here, and it would be bad, I think, for the entire internet sector. Anyone with fiber or servers or wireless connectivity, whether they think they're a tech company or not, could be captured by this.
And Mr. Kimmelman, you've appeared before the committee many times, a good friend of the committee, and always willing to come in and talk to us. But if, as you suggested, things have changed dramatically in the last few years, why wouldn't the Congress deal with that specifically rather than to leave it up to this FCC and then the next FCC? I assume whatever this FCC does, if it survives the legal challenge, and we all believe there would be one, then the next FCC would have the ability to do just exactly the opposite. Why wouldn't we want to make that a more firm-founded future?
I think it's an appropriate goal, Senator Blunt, to aspire to that. I've lived through many FCCs that have changed course. I lived through much litigation around the FCC and, in all honesty, around congressional legislation in this area. And a lot of that litigation is around things on the margin or things about a definition, things that are within a range, within a framework. It's not like black or white. And as you say, because it's so fast-moving, because it's so dynamic, very difficult for Congress to pinpoint precisely not just what needs to happen today, but next year and the following year. So I think it's totally appropriate for Congress to look at this, and I urge you to do so. But one suggestion I would have is if you want to legislate, maybe we can get away from this discussion of is it Title II, is it Title I, is it Title VI or 706, and think about, with your principles, what powers, what goals do you want to establish, what policies do you want to establish, and then what tools do you want experts at an agency to be grappling with on a day-to-day basis. I think if we approached it that way, you'd find much less disagreement than what is apparent on some of these discussions.
Thank you very much, Chairman Thune. Congratulations on your new chairmanship, and congratulations to Senator Nelson. Thank you all for being here. The open nature of the Internet has certainly allowed it to quickly become an essential tool for economic development. We've certainly seen it in my state. And with more than 4 million comments received by the FCC on the proposed net neutrality rules, it's clear that Americans truly recognize the impact of these decisions. As you probably know, I chaired the Judiciary Antitrust Committee and now will be the ranking member with Senator Lee. And I have a strong interest in ensuring robust competition for all users of the Internet. So I thought I'd start with that. My other hat is with antitrust, Mr. Kimmelman, and we've heard some claims that antitrust laws can readily address any effort by Internet providers to use their market power to put any limitations on the open Internet. And I don't think the antitrust law is quite fit to take care of everything. And do you think that there's sufficient to address that? And can you expand on your views of the FCC's role in net neutrality versus the FTC's role?
Thank you, Senator. That's quite a bit. I think antitrust is essential, but it is not sufficient to deal with issues in this area. Remember, antitrust is a very targeted statute. The Sherman Act and the Clayton Acts have you in Congress telling the agencies to prevent a reduction in competition and to prevent efforts to monopolize. It's not about promoting competition. That's what you put in the Communications Act. It's not about preventing all discrimination that is unreasonable. It's about getting at it when it is blocking entry or when it's cartel-type behavior or when it's actually allowing for a dominant firm to expand its dominance. So it can get at a few things, but not everything, even in the competition realm. And then beyond competition, as Dr. Turner-Lee says, there are a lot of other values at stake here. This is about opportunities and equity across our society. That is something the antitrust laws only address through trying to promote consumer welfare. It doesn't address the other attributes. So I think the FCC plays a critical role. Title II is a portion of it, the principles and the rulemaking authority. 706, as a mandate, was offering an ability to extend broadband and possibly even expand it, as Dr. Turner-Leach said, to low-income customers. I think that could be extremely valuable as we move forward and make it affordable for everybody. So it's the combination of the tools I think that's so critical.
Anyone else want to comment on that?
If I could, very briefly,
yeah.
yes. Actually, Gene outlined a terrific explanation of antitrust law, but there's also the Federal Trade Commission and Consumer Protection
Yeah,
Law,
I
Section
asked
5, and that's also very useful and applicable here.
Very good. Thank you. Mr. Simmons, thank you for being here today and for the services that Midcontinent provides in both in Minnesota. And could you expand on what you hear from your customers when it comes to expectations for a free and open internet?
Senator, thank you. I think, when the debate began, and especially the call to arms with the request for information coming from the public, we did, in fact, hear from a goodly number of our customers who were all in favor of regulations, keeping the internet open, even proposing Title II. When I visited with a number of them, they had actually no idea what Title II was. In fact, Title II equals open internet. Yes, we're for that. Let's send a letter. When we started describing what Title II really involves, and by the way, we could send out a couple hundred pages of documentation and start understanding all the components of that, even after reading the text of all of those things, which might in fact be imposed upon us, even then, unless you've actually experienced what that really means in practicality, it's difficult to understand. You can't really imagine what it's like putting together rate and tariff sheets and submissions to the FCC and never mind state regulatory with all this until you've had to put those sheets together and understand how involved it really was. So after we explained what it was really about and that there might in fact be additional costs that would come down on our customers, their favoritism toward Title II diminished rather quickly.
Okay. One last question here. If Congress decides to create a new broadband-focused statute or title, what will happen to the Universal Service Fund if Section 254, which currently governs universal service, is omitted from any such legislation governing broadband? How do you think that affects things like the high cost and E-rate that are just now being reoriented for broadband?
Well, Senator, as drafted, I think it would be very difficult to expand and continue what the FCC has been doing to promote investment in broadband in high-cost rural areas, and it would definitely be impossible to allow just a broadband low-income service for Lifeline. Now, that may not be the intent, but as drafted, that's the way it reads.
Okay, so it's something we'd have to work on. I'm going to just put these questions on the record so I can turn over to my colleagues with the vote, but I do have some questions. I've raised this before on call completion problems really plaguing rural areas, and that's a lot of this ISP to ISP, and I can put it all in writing so we don't have to talk about it now. But thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Senator Moran.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Simmons, you probably come as close to a typical carrier in a state like mine as well in Kansas. And I wanted to hear from you the difficulties you face in deployment of broadband today and how either this legislation or the potential consequences of the FCC decision would affect your ability to deploy broadband, particularly in rural America.
Senator, it's difficult for us to be able to provide services to all those who really require it or need it. There are some areas where, in our service area, where it's just physically, economically unfeasible for a private risk company to answer those particular needs. We're always encouraged with a new program, whether it be stimulus or whether it be an RUS program, that those dollars would be allocated specifically toward those who are unserved. We've not accomplished that goal quite yet. In too many cases, our markets are overbuilt with maybe a little bit of new service to some areas out there, and I guess we've come to expect that, which is why even in our small communities, we have open competition from other providers who are doing pretty much what we do. There's a concern within Title II with all of this, and I guess it would raise some questions on the part of the financial community. You know, I know that some have said it won't impact their plans for investment, and maybe they're a very large publicly traded company that have easier access to cash than we do. But we have to rely on our relationships with private bankers. We need to go out and borrow money from them. We've borrowed money in order to expand our networks even today. Our concern is that their willingness to lend money to take on that risk is substantial today. But with the uncertainty of all this, it may become even more substantial. They may, in fact,
When you say the uncertainty of all this is defined as what?
what Title II really means, the applications of Title II. And frankly, it has not been helpful to have even the speculation about Title II actually becoming the rules under which we'll be regulated. So it does represent a concern, and even our banking partners with all this would take a look at it, and maybe it would cost us more money on the interest rates that are charged today if, in fact, that degree of uncertainty continues. So it is a great concern for us.
Thank you very much. Mr. McDowell, or maybe Mr. Misener, another area of interest, in addition to rural, for me, is innovation. How do we make certain that the next entrepreneur with a great opportunity for success because of the Internet is not hindered in the regulatory environment? And it seems to me there's a couple of ways you could look at this. The certainty is certainly important, but additional costs related to regulation. I want to make certain that that person who goes to their basement or their garage in the back of their office and has this idea has a better chance of success. And it seems to me clearly how we, quote, regulate the Internet has a consequence. Mr. McDowell?
So I'll be real quick so Paul has time for that too, because he's a great expert on this and an old friend. But anyway, so I think it's important for folks to understand the Internet as we know it today, the entire ecosphere, the so-called edge of the core, grew up under existing law, right? And it has blossomed beautifully. It is one of the greatest economic creations by human beings ever. So I think that's important for folks to understand. So why? We need to learn from those lessons because it was relatively unregulated. This came about 7.5 years ago, the mobile Internet, and that has exploded beautifully across the globe. So going forward, I think that the Title II cloud creates a lot of questions, as Mr. Simmons pointed out, but also as Gene Kimmelman's pointed out, there are those who want to bring other aspects of Title II other than just 201 and 202 there. So once you plant that seed, once you classify information services, Supreme Court has said the rest of the tech economy is going to come in with it, and that is going to cause all of the doubts that Mr. Simmons just eloquently pointed out.
That was brief. Thanks, thank you, Mr. McDowell, and thank you, Senator. I think they're answerable in the same area, that is to say innovation investment in both cases. I don't think anybody can credibly argue that they need to block consumer access to Internet content in order to invest. They don't need to throttle to invest. They don't need to fail to disclose their practices in order to invest. And so the reasonable net neutrality kinds of provisions adopted in the bill, or adopted in this discussion draft already, are kinds of things that are not going to harm investment. And it's not credible to say that the inability to block customer or consumer access to information is necessary for investment.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, we got the first vote on, so we'll go Senator Markey, Senator Heller, probably break, go down and vote, and then we'll just have to play it by ear after that, but we'll try and get back as quickly as possible to give other members that want to ask questions an opportunity to do so. Senator Markey.
Congratulations, Mr. Chairman, Senator Nelson, the dawn of a new era. It's great, congratulations. The fact is that we have a device like this, but we had to pass laws to make it possible. Because, believe me, AT&T, there were two companies, two licenses. It was analog, cost 50 cents a minute. You didn't own one of these things in 1994, believe me. You had to change the laws to have the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh company get in. The government had to say, let them in. Okay, so we did that, government. Okay, so all these things all come from policies that we created. I was there. I was chairman over in the House of the Telecommunications Committee. This stuff didn't exist. So you need a policy. You've got to say, how much competition do we want? How much will consumers benefit from it? How much more investment will go in if more companies can get in? That's always the test. And so let's just go to 2013. In 2013, in America, 62% of all venture capital in America in 2013 went to software companies and internet companies, the new companies, companies whose names you don't know. 62% of all venture capital in America Why? Because they believe that they have access to an open internet. They're the Google, eBay, Amazons of this era, because without the laws in the 90s, these companies, you don't have Mr. Misener sitting here. He's not famous. You got to open it up. The big companies don't innovate that way. They innovate in the pipeline, but they don't innovate in new products, new services. They just don't do that. Okay? So that's our big challenge here. And that's why companies like Douala, Etsy, all the coolest companies of today, companies that are the Googles and eBays of today, they want Title II. They want protection. They want to be able to go to the venture capital market and get the capital because they can say, we don't have to worry that we're going to have access to our customers. That's what this is all about. Creating that open, entrepreneurial, chaotic, paranoia-inducing Darwinian marketplace. That's what we have in America. We have to protect it. We have to protect it. And we have to protect everyone else as well. So you agree, Mr. Kimmelman, that Douala, Etsy, all those companies, hundreds of them, are in jeopardy if we don't give them the full Title II protection. Do you agree with that?
I agree completely. I think they're counting on that, and they're counting on the predictability of there not being discriminatory practices and a meaningful enforcement mechanism. And if that's what draws capital to them, that's what makes them invest.
But let's go to universal service. Will the draft before us today guarantee a protection of universal service for all Americans?
Senator, only if you're looking at old-fashioned telephone service. I think if you're looking for investment in broadband and you're looking for making it more affordable, as drafted, it does not reach.
How about senior citizens protections? Would that be protected?
Not for broadband, Senator.
How about guaranteeing that rural America is served? Would that be guaranteed?
Not for broadband, as I read it, Senator Markey.
How about accessibility for the deaf and the blind? I'm the author of almost every telecommunications law mandating accessibility for the deaf and the blind in America. And by the way, all these devices are now accessible because of that. Would that be protected? Could that be advanced?
No, Senator, only for telephone service. Not
Okay,
broadband.
thank you. Now, let's go to privacy on the Internet. Would privacy be protected? Would there be, under this formulation, would the FCC be able to move in order to protect the privacy of Americans?
Senator, as I read it, the customer proprietary network information protections are all entitled to. They're for telecommunications service, so not broadband unless it is considered a telecommunications service.
Thank you. And so we've got all of these things that are there that right now everyone is used to, everyone believes is going to be a part of the future. But if we don't move to Title II, we don't get them, and under the draft that we have right now, they're not there. And so this is a big debate that we have to have in our country, especially when the chief financial officer of Verizon says that it won't affect their investment strategy at all if Title II is used. That's Verizon. But it will affect Douala, Etsy, hundreds of smaller companies who are the innovative companies. They're the ones that change. They're the ones that are branded Made in America. Today we're Google and Hulu and YouTube, but there's a whole new generation coming up 10 years from now whose names we're going to know. Only if we keep it open and they can reach the capital markets and then reach customers on a non-discriminatory basis. And so that's a huge challenge for us here in the committee to get it right, Mr. Chairman, to make sure that this free flow of capital that's now going out of the venture capital firms into the new software and internet companies is not inhibited. That we don't create uncertainty for these companies that are really the heartbeat of what it is that young people all across the country are saying that they want. Network neutrality is just a fancy word for non-discrimination. And in the same way that the Civil Rights Act says non-discrimination in schools and counters for people to go and be served, same thing is true over here. Network neutrality is just a fancy word of saying that anybody can get in, anyone can compete, anyone can innovate. And we have to protect that in America, because that is what has happened over the last 20 years. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Markey. Senator Heller.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing. I appreciate the fact that the first hearing that we have has to do with protecting the Internet from the FCC, from bureaucrats, and I certainly appreciate moving forward on this particular piece of legislation. Hopefully we can come to a consensus. I want to thank all of you for being here. Your testimony has been good and very informative, so I certainly do appreciate all that you're saying. I want to go back to the previous comments made by my friend across the aisle, and he talked about this phone. I guess my question, Mr. McDowell, would this phone exist if if the FCC had regulated the internet 10 years ago?
Probably not, but I do want to agree with something that Senator Markey said, which is this innovation came about.
Yeah, please feel free to respond.
It came about as a result of laws that were passed years ago, and that the marketplace is burgeoning because of laws passed years ago. If this committee wants to restate that in order to give the FCC enforcement authority there, then that's the will of Congress. But we have the wonderful internet we have today because of the existing legal environment.
Ms. Baker, do you have any comments?
I agree. I mean, the innovation has been allowed to explode in the mobile broadband space because it's not, Congress explicitly chose a non-regulatory path for it.
Now, you served on the FCC. Both of you served on the FCC. And in your comments, Mr. McDowell, you talked about litigation. What's your expectation of this going to the courts if the FCC moves forward on their order?
I think a Title II order will definitely go to court. I think it'll be overturned. And by the way, I'm on record. I voted against 2 other net neutrality orders, in part because I thought nothing was wrong that needed fixing, but also because the FCC just didn't have the legal authority to do what it did. So the Section 332 problems, as Commissioner Baker pointed out, I think are real problems on appeal, but also this trying to classify yet massively forbear at the same time is going to look arbitrary and capricious, more like picking political friends rather than having any principled regulation.
With your experience, on the FCC, could you estimate how long it would take for litigation like this to go through?
Well, the last order from 2010 took 37 months, and there was a lot of uncertainty in the interim.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. Regulatory uncertainty at this point. What impact would that have on the industry, Ms. Baker?
We have several rural carriers in particular who are very insecure and have already pulled back on some of their investments because they don't know that they can get, they don't know what advanced services they can do because they don't know how much money they're going to have to spend on lawyers. So it's going to have significant slowing. To what extent, we don't know. Mobile broadband has never been regulated by Title II, so we don't know.
Have you had an opportunity to take a look at the legislative text that the chairman is proposing?
Yes, I think it's a very good start. We are very pleased with the reasonable network management provision that it has some technical parameters to it. There are clearly some issues that we need to have more discussion about, but we are very pleased with the fact that the only way for this industry to have clarity is for Congress to act. The certainty we need happens in this room.
So you would argue that it makes more sense
Absolutely.
for Congress to act as opposed to going through a regulatory scheme?
Yes.
This is the reason I make this point. That if left up to the FCC alone to act, I do believe this will be challenged in court. Obviously, the level of uncertainty that we'd see in the industry for however many months, whether it's 37 months or beyond. And I think there's a pretty good chance the FCC won't win. So what does it do to the industry? And I would argue that this exercise has been all for nothing. We have an opportunity, and, I take a look at what the chairman has done in his particular piece of legislation. Frankly, it's 70% of what the other side of the aisle wants. Prohibiting blocking, prohibiting throttling, prohibiting paid pre-authorization, requiring transparencies. These are everything the other side wants. And I guess, Mr. Chairman, what I don't understand is if they get 70% of what they want, why would they want to risk it? I guess being from Nevada, we know a good bet when we see one. And I think this is a good bet. I really do think this is a good bet.
Senator,
I just don't understand.
May I, Senator? Thank you. I am a longtime proponent of net neutrality. I've been doing this for a dozen years, and I think 2 things. One is, first of all, we're willing to work with Congress for sure. I don't think that's exclusive of the FCC's process. They have an existing statute that they can work with, and they are working with, and should be applauded. But that doesn't preclude us from working together. My testimony was very much designed to work with this committee to develop a strong bill. What you want to accomplish. But I think a little bit too much credit is being given to the forbearance decisions the Commission made a decade ago. Frankly, the network operators have been working under a period of détente where they've been on their best behavior. They've not been doing the bad things that they want to do. They've not been engaged in the blocking and the paid prioritization, principally because they're concerned about FCC coming down on them or Congress coming down on them. So I wouldn't want to give too much credit to the fact that we've been in this forbearance position for a dozen years, but I'm happy to work with you on legislation.
And I appreciate that, because that's what I want. That's what I want the other side to come with us, work with us, get something done. I just have one more question, Mr. Chairman, if you'll work with me on this. Mr. Kimmelman, if this FCC order wasn't prepared and moving forward based on what the chairman has introduced with his legislative text, would you vote for it? Would you support it? If the FCC
Senator, I wish I had a vote. I think it's commendable. I think by taking away some of the fundamental powers of enforcement, I would still be extremely worried even if the FCC were doing nothing. Because even if the FCC is doing nothing, I think Mr. Misener is absolutely right. There is an air of sense that somewhere between information services and Title II, this industry has to behave, and it has been doing so. And I think that lack of predictability is an uncertainty that has actually driven a huge amount of investment while litigation is going on, while there's a lot of problems. I would want to make, and that's with an understanding the FCC has this residual authority. It's like a hammer that they could use. So I would want to preserve some kind of a hammer or some kind of a flexibility to make sure that you're forward-looking. But I think it's a great start, Mr. Chairman and Senator Heller. I think we can work on things, but there are some very big issues that need to be worked out.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thanks for proposing this legislation. I want to get both sides to work together so that we can solve this problem.
Thank you, Senator Heller. Great panel, great discussion. When we come back, Senator Booker will be up first, followed by Senator Daines, and hopefully that will how these votes go. But I appreciate, again, your patience and indulgence, and I do have to brag on my home state guy. PC Magazine said that Midcontinent Cable is the fastest ISP in the nation recently. So we'll adjourn, or at least I shouldn't say adjourn, but recess temporarily, and hopefully be back here in an hour-ish. Thank you. All right, we're back. And in typical Senate fashion, it's a model of efficiency, getting through a series of votes on the floor. But we appreciate, again, so much the patience of everybody who's here, and particularly our panelists. Thank you for hanging around. Is the Senator from Montana ready to ask questions, or should I?
Mr. Chairman, we're ready.
All right. I would recognize the Senator from Montana, Senator Daines.
Thank you. I'm down over here in the extended part of the table here, but thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this most important hearing. I have a little different background than many who come to the United States Senate. I had the chance to spend 28 years in the private sector before being elected to Congress a couple years ago and then coming over to the Senate. Several years ago, I left a job at Procter & Gamble to come home to my home state of Montana and was part of an internet startup company. In fact, it was just a small company when I joined, and 12 years later, we've grown to 1,000 employees. We're one of the larger employers in the state of Montana. And it was a great success story. Here we are in Montana, the land of fly fishing, and a river runs through it, and yet growing a world-class internet company. In fact, it was cloud computing, and back in those days, we didn't know what the cloud was. We thought it was something to deal with maybe something up in the sky. But it turned into a tremendous success. It capitalized at $1.8 billion, built a global company that was acquired by Oracle. So I just share that as background, kind of where I'm coming from as we engage in this most important issue. And I remember when I joined the company, I asked the CEO before I joined the executive team, I said, what's your competitive differentiator? And he said, I can run faster than anybody else. It was speed. The ability to innovate and create value faster than anybody else. And we competed globally against companies and competitors all over the world. We're very proud to be an American company that was winning in the technology space. Well, as that is background, and going back to Ms. Baker's comment earlier, and I know that was a long time ago when we were last here before the votes, but you said something that piqued my interest about what happened in Europe with 3G when they were out in front. And then because of overregulation, suddenly they no longer have global leadership. Could you maybe expand on that a bit more? And you know, what regulations caused that, do you think? And what are some of the watch-outs we should be aware of here as a committee as we think of the right policy moving forward?
Well, welcome, and thank you for the first question. So I appreciate it, and your background's perfect to understand this. I really think, you know, what happened was the United States got the environment right. We got the deregulatory climate for wireless. We got the auctions. Meanwhile, in Europe, they were the leaders of 3G, and they said, you know, we're going to put in wholesale regulations. We're going to do price regulation. We're going to do mandate roaming, and they did not put any low-band auction out there. And in the course of that time from 2006 to 2010, we started building the foundation for our 4G networks, which are now the world's leader, and where we both basically have the same number of subscribers. We have 5% of the world's subscribers. We have 50% higher CapEx and investment than they do. And it's because we got it right and they got it wrong. And after building their house of regulation, we had people like Nellie Cruz, who, as you recall, was very adamant about regulation. She's now looking at the United States market, and she says, we want to be like them. They got it right. We'll get it right for 5G. And I think we have places like Japan and South Korea who are like, wow, the United States beat us so badly in 4G that maybe we're just going to skip to 5G. So it's really about getting the environment right, and you know, the rest of the world's at our heels, so we need to get it. We need to make sure we continue to get it right here.
I think that's one of my great concerns, certainly. Someone's been on the other side, I guess, in the private sector in looking at the famous adage, we're from Washington, D.C., and we're here to help, in terms of what this could do for on the upside, but potentially the downside here as it relates to a regulatory environment that could hinder value creation and growth and global competitiveness.
Can I add to that?
Yes, please.
Senator, if you don't mind. I think also, just from the statistics that I mentioned about the over-indexing of people of color on wireless, I think the point that we're actually seeing in Europe is one that we should take, you know, and with some caution, because what we're seeing, particularly with communities of color, is this use of the 4G and expanding networks, because many of those families are wireless-only households. So I think, again, to your point, we really have to get this right here, because that is actually going to be, I think, the on-ramp for some of these low-income and more vulnerable consumers that are actually adopting wireless first before they go into more wireline services.
Thank you. Mr. McDowell, what do you think as you look at regulation? What concerns you in terms of a regulation that would hinder innovation in terms of our high-tech sectors here that could harm what we're trying to do here as a country to maintain global competitiveness?
Well, regulations always have a cost, one way or another. And the most common cost, which is the hardest to measure, are the unintended consequences, or what innovation did not come to market as a result of that regulation. That's very hard to measure. So I like to turn it around to say, well, what's worked in the internet ecosphere? A lot of things have worked right, and that's based on the laws that were put into effect, not Title II, but other laws that were put into effect. And where's the innovation investment going? It's in the least regulated areas.
Why is the FCC have the sense of urgency to want to put these regulations in place next month? I'm just a little bit, I am somewhat new to the Hill and wondering what is the sense of urgency here to put these regulations in place without some careful deliberation, hearings, and so forth. And I'd be curious in panel's thoughts.
Senator, thank you. As someone who's worked on this issue for 12 years, I don't think there's any urgency at all. It's been a dozen years of debate and no action. I agree completely with Commissioner Baker that we need to get it right with respect to net neutrality, especially as opposed to Europe, because here you have the internet content providers are American companies. The network operators are American companies. In Europe, the network operators are European companies, and the internet content providers are American companies. And so if we get net neutrality wrong here, you can bet that we won't have a leg to stand on in Europe.
Yeah, thank you. Sharon, I think my time's expired, but thank you. Yeah.
Senator Daines, Senator Booker.
Thank you very much, Chairman Thune, and I want to thank the ranking member. So I gave you guys some nice words, but I'll skip them now because that's my time. This is an issue very passionate about, and I'm grateful for the commentary of everyone. And I think that we all have a lot of similar ambitions in terms of what the open free internet would be. But I'd love to tailor my conversations with you, Dr. Turner-Lee, because in your testimony, I love where you come from, a lot of the same spirits that I do. And, while government may seem scary to some people, I wouldn't be sitting here today if it wasn't for the federal government protecting my rights. The town I grew up in, it was the government putting in place certain frameworks to protect a black family that wanted to move in. And so when it comes to the Goliath, whether it's industry or what have you, the government is really important. And I hold here this area of debate, and here's section 2. There's a big section here
And Chairman Thune is somebody I have deep respect for and think he's done a courageous thing by putting a bill out. And I appreciate, Chairman, that you say this is the beginning of a conversation. But it basically eviscerates a lot of the key elements that are put in place in Section 202 of Title II that specifically refer to disadvantaged and minority communities. Now, I know that mobile may be doing a great job in leading the globe, but broadband certainly is not. We are behind our global competitors, and specifically, if you look at a map of minority communities, poor communities, those are the ones where private enterprise often doesn't see the urgency to get there. And so I was curious in your testimony when I read it, your written testimony, that you rely in some ways on Section 706 for protections and others, but yet this legislation doesn't give those protections. Let me give you a couple examples. Right now, we're waiting on the FCC to allow 2 cities with high poverty, high minority, Wilson, North Carolina, which is a majority minority city, blacks and Latinos, and Chattanooga, a city I've long since admired, that has a significant minority population. And what these cities said is that we want to give better access to broadband, and we want to have our own municipal broadband. And their states, however, have said, this is a locality wanting to determine its own destiny. Their states have said, no, you can't. We passing laws preventing that, which the big Goliaths all support. And so this is David versus Goliath. This legislation takes that ability to fight Goliath out where they can't appeal to the federal government. So next month, the FCC was going to get a chance to rule using Section 706 that is specifically eviscerated in the legislation you put forward to allow these 2 cities to do something that's actually pretty incredible. Faster broadband than even the big Goliaths are doing, free, open access for minority communities. And so these are the kind of protections that to me are essential for us as a nation to activate the genius and entrepreneurialism of other communities. The proposed legislation would end the FCC's ability to remove barriers to small businesses and minority-owned businesses in many ways that communities have traditionally benefited from the agency protection in a world where marketplace is often tipped towards the biggest companies and quote-unquote high-value customers. Well, kids in Newark and Camden, to me, are high-value customers. And they stand to lose the most if the Commission's authority is all but stripped by this new law. So you state in your testimony that the committee should consider quote-unquote a legislative proposal to promote an open internet, provided it preserves the Commission's ability to protect consumers. And so I just really want to put you to be specific, because you seem to be advocating for things that are not yet in the proposed legislation that I fully support, to make sure that this world is far more equal to those folks that seem to consistently lose out when it comes to opportunity and equality in our country. You got to push the button.
I got to push the button right now. I've only been here 2 hours, right? I figured that one out. So first of all, I want to say congratulations. We follow you on Twitter. We follow you wherever you go. We are so happy that you're in the seat.
Thank you very much.
I want to put that as public acknowledgement.
And that's for the record.
Yeah, it is for the record. And I also want to say, too, to your point, I'm glad that we do share the same goals. I've always known that we have, but just by listening to things that you say, that broadband adoption is the #1 civil rights issue and concern of this time. And I think to what Senator Markey said earlier, it's a new lunch counter debate for many of us in our community, and the 30 million people that aren't online, the people that we kind of care about versus the digital elite in our community, are really important to kind of let them know the value and importance of broadband. So I want to address on that. When the civil rights groups, the ones that we represent, which are more traditional, came forth when the chairman put out his proposal, it was always with the Section 706 provision with strong consumer protection. So you're correct, because Section 706 has actually enabled communities of color to do a lot of things, right? Stop and ban redlining. It's helped us with minority media ownership, universal service fund, et cetera. So with respect to the use of 706 in the testimony, I do talk about, this idea of still keeping that on the table as some point of legislative debate or discussion as you try to move towards a bipartisan bill. I mean, part of this discussion I think was so wonderful about these hearings is the fact that Congress is talking to one another about this, and those of us that are on the side wanting to do the very things that you're interested in and making sure that there's nobody left behind. we get this chance to say, please do talk to each other because we want to move on to the business of other areas. With regards to the statement that we put out there, I mean, there were a couple of things that we did put into the written statement as well about digital redlining being a very important piece that, again, if you eviscerate 706, you won't be able to deal with redlining in a very important way, or universal service reform. And I think that's important to note for this hearing as well. So we asked the chairman and, and the ranking member to consider that in that conversation of how we actually come together and get past the morass of some of the division on this bill, which I think, again, for us, is a promising discussion for the primary reasons of getting back to the business of adoption, the issues that you care about. On the Muni thing, just the last thing, just to respond to the municipal broadband. So we at MMTC really have not taken an opinion on that. We put out a press statement applauding the president for his commitment to universal broadband adoption and deployment, and we see that as part of this broader way to actually expand that. But one of the things, again, digital redlining, we have to also be careful that we're not creating these fiber hoods in communities where we actually give people permission to build broadband and deploy it, but yet we pass over communities within that neighborhood, or we build on beachfront. And sometimes we as a community have felt the disproportionate impact of being passed over as a result of that.
And so I'll end, and I want to put some things in the record, but just to the last municipal broadband point, having been a mayor, the best innovation in America, if you want to talk about what's going on in this country in terms of governments, it's not going on at the federal level, it's not even at the state level, it's at the municipal level, and to eviscerate municipalities' ability to innovate, especially because disproportionate poor minorities live in cities, would be unconscionable and unacceptable to me. And I hope it's something that we can consider in discussions for the legislation that is being considered by the chairperson. I want to enter for the record, if the chairperson will allow, number one, an op-ed I authorized with Senator King outlining the importance of strong net neutrality rules. Number two is a letter from the Internet Association expressing concerns with the proposed legislation. And very importantly, number three, letters from civil rights and social justice groups, over 100 of them, advocating for Title II, really specifically because of a lot of the protections, the bedrock protections that that are statutorily in Title II that allow, like the civil rights legislation, like the voting rights legislation, that allow minorities and others that bedrock defense of their rights, so that Goliath cannot succeed over the noble Davids out there.
And Senator, just for you, we're not on that letter because we actually are against Title II, but we do believe in the same things.
Right. Well, I hope whatever we do does not trample over the rights of minorities, poor, rural, and others that are so important to the success of America.
Yeah.
And we agree on that, and we think you're very discerning, Dr. Turnley, in that respect. Thank you, Senator Booker, and Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing and for your legislative proposal, which I think is certainly an effort to bring us together on this issue. And I know we may have differences within this room, but I think all of us share the goal of protecting consumers, which are your customers, and we may differ about the best way to do it. For me, as a former Attorney General, as a law enforcer, this hearing has a certain Alice in Wonderland quality, because normally the folks in favor of flexibility are saying, don't legislate. And the folks in favor of bright line rules are saying, put it in statute. And here we have the claim that legislation will somehow lead to more flexibility and discretion, which I think may be not only counterintuitive, but counterfactual. And my concern is that we are removing potentially authority that would prevent the FCC from confronting disparities in access among consumers of different incomes or in different geographic areas, stopping anti-competitive behavior in an increasingly consolidating market, and protecting consumer privacy, and precisely the types of disparities and problems that the Communications Act sought to prevent. So as technology hurdles forward, I hope that we can go back to the principles of the Act, the 6 foundational principles of the Communications Act, and make sure that we preserve the discretion and authority of the FCC to protect consumers. With that in mind, in a way, Mr. Misener and Mr. Kimmelman, I note a number of similarities between your respective testimonies. In particular, you both note the importance of preserving interpretive rulemaking authority for the FCC. And I'd like to ask both of you to expand on this. Mr. Misener, this proposal seems to provide a fair amount of certainty for the major broadband companies, but not all that many others, without granting the FCC the ability to define the key terms and respond to a quickly evolving marketplace. Don't businesses that rely on the internet face a fair amount of uncertainty?
Thank you, Senator. When American companies are choosing whether to invest in a particular country around the world, one of the very first things they examine is the legal regime. They want the certainty, the transparency, the reliability, the stability of that legal regime. We seek the same thing here. We want that certainty to know whether and to what extent we may be offering services to our customers without interference from broadband internet access providers in between. And if we get that certainty, then we'll be able to deploy more investment. And there's a tension that came up earlier in the hearing today, Senator. The tension was between the level of authority and the fear of overreach. Okay, that has to do with existing statute. We come in squarely in between, saying we believe the Commission has sufficient authority and doesn't need to overreach. But in the context of this legislation, the brilliance of it is to establish really strong, what I've called excellent principles, but with a cap, a ceiling on top. And if we're able to work within this framework of deciding what principles are there, but also telling the agency not to overreach, that seems like the best way to balance this and provide the certainty that companies like mine need.
Mr. Kimmelman, it seems like the lack of clarity surrounding some key aspects of this proposal would likely provide incentives for litigation. The lack of certainty will lead the parties to court. Just as an example, I'm not sure I understand exactly what falls inside or outside the definition of a specialized service. So let me ask you, what hope does an individual consumer have against the legal and the lobbying sway and, in fact, overwhelming power of some of the bigger players here if there is that lack of clarity?
Thank you, Senator. I think you're absolutely right. I think it's very hard for consumers after the fact. I think Mr. Misener said this well before. If something's happening to their service, they have no idea where in the network the problem is. They have no idea who to blame or who's responsible. And so very hard to come in after the fact and file a complaint when you're not even sure who is responsible and the other side has massive resources. I actually agree with Mr. Misener's general approach. I would say, though, that from my perception of what is going on at the FCC, that it would be best to sit back and wait and see the details, because I believe they will, within their responsibility, as Mr. Misener indicated, move forward prudently and appropriately to address all of the principles that the chairman has put out in this draft. I don't believe it'll be an overreach. I would be stunned if it were. And I think at that point it would be appropriate for the committee to look at that and see, is there something that is left that needs to be adjusted? I think the FCC has gotten the message loud and clear to be careful and prudent in how it applies its current authority.
So you're saying, in effect, that legislation at this point may be a solution in search of a problem before we know whether there is overreach?
Senator, I wouldn't want to go that far. I think it's always appropriate for the Senate to consider what the appropriate policies are. But I, again, just urge caution and prudence here to wait and see what some of the details are before moving too far.
So let me draw a different analogy then. What you're suggesting is a yellow blinking light instead of a red or a green.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. And just as a point here, the special services definition in the draft is drawn from the FCC's 2010 rules, former Chairman Waxman's 2010 legislative proposal, and the President's recent statements, which all recognize development of specialized services as a pro-innovation policy. Senator from West Virginia, Senator Manchin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for this hearing. Sorry we've been running all different committees today, but I want to thank all of you. I come from a rural state of West Virginia, which is a small rural state, like a lot of rural states in America. On Saturdays during football season, West Virginia University Football Stadium is our largest city. It holds about 66,000 people, and that's our largest city. So it gives you an idea of what we're dealing with. In a small rural state like mine, a pure deregulation doesn't have really a good track record. It didn't work with the phone companies, didn't work with the utility companies, didn't work with the airlines. And we don't, if you tell a person, don't you worry, we're going to give you better service, we've had past experience where we don't believe that. So I guess we're a little bit like Missouri, the show me state. What has worked in West Virginia is a public-private partnership model like the Universal Service Fund, where private companies get a little help, a little incentive to make investments and expand into our rural areas where you normally wouldn't go because of markets. We understand that. This year we had over 90,000 West Virginians who will get broadband service because of the USF programs. What concerns me, and you tell me if it's real, Mr. Kimmelman, maybe you know, that the FCC has told me that the bill will undercut the ability to continue these programs if we pass this bill. And if you could explain that in your opinion, I would appreciate it, sir.
Thank you, Senator Manchin. I do believe it's a problem because that program originally started as for telecommunications service and to subsidize rural America to make sure in the high-cost areas that we all had connectivity.
Right.
So it's related to the definition of telecommunications service. The FCC has now tried to use its powers under 706 to extend broadband and offer incentives for investment in broadband in rural America. It has used Section 254 in conjunction with 706. Way too much in the weeds, Senator, but the main point is that those are powers that in the draft as it currently exists could be eviscerated. And so while that it would still be there for telephone service, for extending broadband, it's a big question mark.
If I could just comment on that, I was a commissioner at the FCC when we reformed the Universal Service Distribution Program in the fall of 2011, October of 2011. And actually, we reformed it to support broadband. And it was actually, now it's a broadband subsidy rather than an old-fashioned phone subsidy. This bill, in my legal opinion, does not undermine. I know that probably Chairman Thune from South Dakota, a net recipient, would not support or draft a bill if it undermined universal service. What it will perhaps do is cabin off the ability of the FCC to tax broadband internet access and raise consumers' rates therefore. But in terms of the distribution side, that order should stand. And I don't see any language in this bill that would harm the distribution of universal service.
Will we be able to have the FCC here so we can find out who's telling the truth?
Well, that's
or whose opinion's accurate? Let's put it that way. I'm sorry.
You could grab 6 of them over there, Joe.
Okay, very quickly, because my time's running out and I need to ask Mr. Misener something.
I agree with both Commissioner McDowell as well as Jean in terms of being just really careful that the authority is not granted to protect universal service. But there's also the creative way that a provision could be put into the legislation that could actually enforce it as well. So I think that's another way to actually look at it. So without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, I think we could also look at a provision that goes into the draft legislation that could actually protect the universal service fund.
Mr. Misener, in 1996, you were a startup company, right? Amazon?
Yes, sir.
Okay. If we're trying to strike the balance between the free market and consumer protections, and I think it's been said, can't we create a regulatory regime with innovation stifled because the federal government cannot keep up with the speed of business. However, as you know, regulators need to have oversight to ensure a level playing field, right? And fair competition among all entrepreneurs in big and small. What changes, if any, would be needed if the bill to ensure that today's startups are able to compete on a level playing field? How would this affected you?
Thank you, Senator. We always think in terms of our customers and their access to us and the kinds of services that we want to be able to provide to them. And so it's the choice of consumers that matters most. The startups will do fine so long as consumers can reach them. If somehow consumers, however, are cut off from them, the startups won't succeed, but the consumers will be denied the choice. If we have net neutrality provisions that are reasonable, not overreaching, ones that actually protect that consumer choice, the startups will be fine. The innovators will be able to provide their services without permission from broadband network operators to the consumers who have the choice.
Mr. Chairman, if I could submit the rest of my questions to the committee.
You bet. Thank the Senator from West Virginia, Senator Schatz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking forward to working with you and Ranking Member Nelson and my subcommittee chair, Senator Wicker. We all agree that an open internet has to function in today's society, and that's why I think it's important for us to work together to consider the best path forward to protect net neutrality. As we consider our options, we've got to aim to accomplish and balance three objectives, in my opinion: to provide maximum protection to consumers, to provide maximum flexibility to promote innovation and the internet economy, while also enabling continued investment in the state-of-the-art broadband infrastructure. Congress always has the prerogative to legislate, but we also have to recognize the advantages of an expert agency, and especially in the area of the internet, the FCC needs to have flexible, forward-looking authority to protect consumers and an innovative internet. I'm afraid that the draft legislative proposal would make it nearly impossible for the FCC to deal with future problems or opportunities as they come up. The point here is that when it comes to telecommunications and the internet, Congress is best suited to establish broad policies, but the particulars ought to be left to the expert agency. So while I intend to keep an open mind on possible legislation, I do have deep reservations about intervening in the FCC's ongoing rulemaking. I believe this flexibility is really critical, and I have a question perhaps for all the panel, depending on time, but I'll start with Mr. Kimmelman. I'm concerned this draft legislation doesn't preserve the authority in the FCC that it needs. My question is simply, is there a way to modify this legislation that holds net neutrality harmless, but also allows the FCC to evolve and promulgate rules and respond to circumstances that are going to be very difficult to anticipate from this committee?
Yes, thank you, Senator Schatz. There certainly is. I mean, it's up to Congress how to draft it. I think this is a matter of getting past the all the titles and the characterizations and getting at the functions. Flexibility requires giving the FCC tools, giving them, as you say, principles, guidance, direction, and parameters for action, and then giving them the flexibility to work with it. That has traditionally been rulemaking authority. Congress can obviously call it whatever it wants, but the attributes need to be there in order for that flexibility to exist.
Thank you. Mr. Misener?
Thank you, Senator. You know, some of the arguments against the FCC's actions actually are sort of arguments against having an FCC in the first place. And if there weren't an agency there now, part of the discussion might be, should we create a specialized agency? That's obviously a counterfactual. Yes, the agency is 80 years old, but that's also a good thing. It's been around for a long time. It works on a lot of things. It's a big, large agency. It does some good things. I can't imagine net neutrality being lower than number, say, 3 or 4 on the list of things that the FCC is working on. So if we've got a regulatory agency specialized in telecommunications, they ought to be working on net neutrality above so many other things that they already work on.
Senator, I can just add that very quickly, which is the Federal Trade Commission has jurisdiction here. Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act protects consumers in all sorts of complex tech industries. It could be internet search, it could be computer software, disk operating systems, things of that nature. And actually what Title II would do would be to take away the authority from the FTC under something called the common carrier exemption, which is in the statute, and put it only in the hands of the FCC. And so I actually think your own logic shows that you probably don't want Title II legislation. You want to have perhaps similar type consumer protection and enforcement only type protections. The FTC has worked quite well as an enforcement only non-rulemaking body for over 100 years, not just 80 years. So if the length of time of an agency is the measure of its success, then I guess the FTC is more successful than the FCC.
Ms. Baker.
I agree with Rob. I think that people understand regulators regulate. The last example that we could see was when the FCC thinks that what they're going to do and what the consumers actually think that they're doing is the apps community. When the FCC enacted Text 911, it affected the apps community. I think bringing everybody under Title II is not the way to go. I think the legislation is the first option so that we can have great security as to what the future brings. And the FCC, the much more legal path forward for all consumers is 706.
Right, I'll just wrap up. My time has expired, but it seems to me that the arguments you're making against the FCC's actions are really particular to the FCC's proposed rules, but it's not as though it is necessary in order to legislate to take away all future authority and flexibility from the FCC. So that is the balance that I'm trying to explore here. It's possible that we won't be able to achieve that balance. It's possible that the FCC moves forward with its rules and we can't come to a consensus. But I want to allow for the possibility that there's a space for legislation and allowing the FCC to continue to do its work. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Schatz. Senator Peters, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd certainly like to thank you, Chairman Thune and Ranking Member Nelson, for convening this hearing and for your work, and certainly appreciate your work, Senator Thune, as well as my home state colleague or former colleague, Congressman Upton, and your work on this bill as we go forward. Because I certainly am a believer that, as everybody I think on this committee, that affordable high-speed internet is an issue that we're all hearing about back in our districts, and understand that it's extremely important that it is open, it is available, and I certainly appreciated Senator Markey's earlier comments talking about if you're looking at trying to develop business and small businesses in particular. That is what I hear when I'm home. I was in an incubator in Detroit just a few weeks ago, and all of those companies that are coming up with incredible ideas. And I might say, if I may put a little plug in for Detroit here, where people kind of have a view of Detroit, if you go into this incubator and close your eyes and open your eyes up when you walk in, you think you're in Silicon Valley, not in Detroit, Michigan, but you are in Detroit, Michigan. So there's a lot of exciting things happening, and it's a result of the internet and the open architecture that's there that we want to make sure is there going forward. Now, whether that means using Title II, whether it means legislation, whether it means doing a combination of the two, I'm certainly open to that as well. And look forward to a further discussion of these issues. But I have a couple things I just wanted to ask the panel broadly about the future, because as I think every one of you said at various times, that this is a constantly evolving area, that we've got to stay on top of it. So we want to make sure that we have a framework that is flexible. So first question is, as you know, the Communications Act was last overhauled back in 1996, and I'd be curious of all of your opinions. Do you see the draft legislation that we're discussing here today as a stopgap measure meant to endure for just a year or two while we're working on this new act, or do you think this could be a long-term framework for broadband regulation for years to come? If we could just start maybe with Ms. Baker.
I support this as something that we have an issue of net neutrality that needs to be addressed, and I think this is a great start to addressing net neutrality. I think that there could be a COM Act rewrite that would also occur to address greater issues. I think when Senator Markey was talking about the digital issues with disabilities, he did a great job on CCBA enacting a targeted legislation for disabilities going forward in an IP world, and it's made a world of difference. I think that this is a great foundation. I think it will endure, but I think that there could be parts of the COM Act that could also be re-examined, since 1996 was a long time ago.
Senator Peters, a great question. I think that from watching this industry for more than 30 years and participating here, this is your one shot at the apple. I don't see Congress coming back to this over and over again. It never has. I can't imagine it ever will. And in this environment, it's quite difficult. So I'd say if you're going to legislate, set policy and think about everything you need to do, and think about doing no harm as well. And I think that in trying to address a direct issue related to net neutrality and a lot of principles that all of us agree on, there are a number of things that are left out. There are a number of things that may do harm. And I think you ought to be really careful about that because this will endure. I can't imagine that we're doing multiple bills through Congress this year.
So I've known Gene a long time, and surprisingly, we agree on more things than people realize. So we believe that I think any future legislation should focus on consumer protection. And I also agree with do no harm. I think to answer your question directly, the answer is yes. Actually, you can have this bill and you can have a comprehensive rewrite, but you don't have to do it all at the same time. You could do this bill first, and then later it gets incorporated into a comprehensive rewrite. I think a comprehensive rewrite is needed to tear down those silos that are technology-centric, that were created in 1934, and that let's look at it through the lens of consumers, and consumers don't really care how they get their information so long as they're getting it and they're able to generate it.
Senator, I think it's most important to get it right because we don't know whether it's going to endure or not. We don't know whether it's going to be subsumed into a new act or overtaken by a new act, but we have to get it right.
Yeah, thank you.
Senator, from our standpoint, we think this is a reasonable framework. At least it's something that is not an attempt to reconfigure something old into something required new. I had an acquaintance who offered some prairie logic, and he told me that it makes absolutely no sense to try to figure out how and what part of the crescent wrench we need to use in order to pound a nail. What we really need to do is to provide somebody with a hammer. I think in this situation, we need to provide the right tools to the FCC for them to do their job. I don't believe they have the right tools now. Our debate is about trying to configure the tools that might be available into something that could be useful when in fact we need to develop the right tools. And I believe this legislation is a reasonable framework to do just that.
So I agree with most of what's said on the panel, and I'll offer some other thoughts, Senator, and it is a great question, having looked at the COM Act. So I think that this juncture that we're in is to address this net neutrality debate and the legal gymnastics that we've been in for a long time. We need to give the FCC something that can withstand in the court, and I think we should take that seriously and stop putting all these other issues into the bucket and do a comprehensive Telecom Act rewrite. I think the modernization of that act is so critical to so many other parts of the ecosystem that we would be fooling ourselves, but we think that we cannot go back to that and revisit what that 1934 Act looks like. Even the last update on spectrum policy in 1996, the ecosystem has changed dramatically. So I would just suggest that if this process can go forth with the draft legislation, that this is seen as a provision in that larger bill that we can't take back. And so I think the seriousness of getting past this is important, but I don't think we need to come back to this again, because that's what we're trying to stop by having this conversation.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. And I would echo what's been said, and we would love to do an update, time to modernize the act, and that's a debate for another day. But right now we're focused specifically on this issue, and it's an issue I think that needs to be dealt with and addressed and provided some certainty for. My understanding is Senator Booker has one more question. Is that correct? Yes. I think Senator Nelson has one more question, and Senator Cantwell has been willing to defer to Senator Booker, so we would like to proceed.
Yeah, great. I just want to, Dr. Turner, Dr. Turner-Lee, excuse me. I just want to ask one more question because I actually think, again, we agree that these issues urgently need to be addressed, but I just don't understand your cure for them. And the reason why over 100 civil rights organizations have signed on to that letter is because the court specifically said that the only way you could regulate the bad behavior is by making them common carriers under Title II. And I just want to ask from you, you rely on Section 706. You say in your testimony that one approach would be to use consumer-friendly complaint process modeled on the probable cause paradigm in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, having dealt with the world of EEOC complaints, having had one parent that was dealing with that professionally, a lot of people find that process wholly inadequate to deal with bias, racism, and other types of discrimination. In fact, when you're asking in terms of this world of technology, poor communities, communities of color, to have the sophistication with which to file complaints when they're not engineers and not the like, they often don't happen. I bring your attention to even some of my colleagues last year who put forth a minority paper criticizing this very process by which to stop discrimination. Their report was entitled EEOC, using the process you say, putting the onus on the consumer to make the complaint. Their paper was titled EEOC, an agency on the wrong track, litigation failures, misfocused priorities, and lack of transparency raise concerns about an important anti-discrimination agency. So I would just ask you to respond that if we really are about the goal of making sure that minorities, poor communities, disadvantaged communities, marginalized communities, who right now aren't even being served by the juggernauts and the behemoths in this area, why do you think that this is an adequate cure when it's not in the civil rights world? And that's why, again, over 100 civil rights organizations have stepped forward and said Title II is the way to go because the court has specifically said that's the only way that FCC has the authority with which to stop discriminatory practices.
So this is an interesting one. I'd love to follow this up after this, too, and keep talking to you about it, because I think it's a healthy dialogue. So one of the reasons, and people have asked us that, why we actually chose not to go with an imposition of a Title II framework is primarily, again, because if we look at modern 1934 monopolistic practices and why the COMM Act was designed to sort of break up the bills, that had a lot to do with the fact that telephone service was more ubiquitous in our communities. I mean, your grandmother, my grandmother, we all had phones, we all had phone numbers, it was easy to talk and hear. Now we're seeing broadband as so transformative that it's beyond just a static communications protocol, but it's things for our communities that matter the most, like telemedicine, distance learning, and all those other things. The fear of a Title II regime that allows that innovation to stop in our communities when we have such a broadband adoption gap is something that we should take very seriously. Yes, we want to put in protections. I totally agree with you, Senator, and humbly agree with you, that we need to find ways to level the playing field so that more people can participate. But if we put in a regulatory regime against a regime that has actually allowed our folks to get more engaged in this ecosystem, to solve community problems, I think we're making a big mistake. And we need to really, as a researcher, we need to look at that. Those places that have not been built out yet may never get built out. They may get passed over because it's no longer going to be companies making money in other places to invest. It may be something different. So I think we need to look at those kinds of issues.
Just to interrupt, because I'm smiling because there is a regulatory regime in place to enforce the law right now, to make sure that there is more broadband penetration, to make sure that localities like Wilson, North Carolina do their job. And what you're recommending here is to strip the federal government of that authority and shift the onus and the burden on the very disadvantaged poor populations, to put the burden on them to try to fight for their rights through a process that's proven anemic even in the civil rights community.
Well, on the case of the EEOC, I'll tell you why we actually chose that. Outside of my boss being a fan of the EEOC, and those that know David Honig know that this is something that he's done as a civil rights lawyer for years, we tried to figure out a process where you just couldn't put 706 by itself. We felt as civil rights groups on this side of the argument that if we were going to propose 706, we could not do it without a way of enforcing and showing that there should be stronger consumer protections. EEO, for all of its flaws, has still been the go-to place for anybody to actually bring forth any kind of complaint or litigation without fear of reprisal or having somebody, losing their job. It has been a place where we've been able to carefully archive what those injustices have been so that other people can come and actually take advantage of the lessons that are learned without having to get an attorney. It also has been a place where we're actually able to help consumers not have to wait for a very long time to figure out if their resolution is going to be resolved. We've talked to the Commission about this proposal. We've talked to enforcement. We've done our due diligence, Senator, in all honesty, about this, because we think if you're going to go a 706 route, you have to have a strong consumer protection. What our fear is, if we say that we're going to take Title II and we decide to forbear all of those things, what is the risk of a new commission coming in and reversing that decision? What is the risk of going into litigation on that takes the attention away from universal service reform, broadband deployment adoption, all the things you care about, just because we're back in a quagmire with the FCC where we're not talking about our issues? I think those are serious concerns, and I respect many of those groups that are on that letter because we work with them on issues related to voting rights and other things. But we really have to think carefully and be cautious about the steps that we make, because we have a 30 million person adoption problem in this country that is not narrowing even among.
Right. And my time is expired. I want to be respectful of my colleagues. I'll just finish by saying that the beautiful statements in your beginning of your statement to me don't hold with your cure. And in a nation where there's a tragic digital divide and where the internet is essential for poor children, for kids in rural neighborhoods, essential for families, and the situation as it is not acceptable to you or me to take the teeth away from the only mechanism to enforce some vision in this country of that we can catch up with other competitors in the globe and have broadband penetration, have equal access, equal opportunity. The only hope often marginalized, disadvantaged communities have to stand up to the big Goliaths in the industry is often, as we've seen in civil rights and voting rights, the federal government.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hopefully we can get together, Senator, and keep talking.
Okay.
I fully encourage that. I'm fascinating discussion. And I'm very hopeful that you win that argument. But I do think there's, this points out there are a lot of questions, and I think that the point that Dr. Turner-Lee is getting to is the legal uncertainty and the just potential for a future commission. I mean, these things, you create this. You'll be in court all the time on these and all range of it. Congress ought to be heard on this. I mean, let's set some rules that apply to the modern age, not to the age that existed in 1934. Thank you, Senator Booker. Senator Cantwell.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and sorry I've been on the floor for most of the day in helping to manage for our side of the aisle the legislation on the Keystone Pipeline, but this is an issue of great concern to me and to my constituents in the state of Washington, so I wish I was able to be here in person, but the great thing about the internet is that I'll be able to watch this hearing and see what everybody said and review it. And that's exactly the point. I'm here to fight for an open internet and to make sure that I have that right, and that I'm not going to be artificially slowed down or throttled or paid extra because somebody like an ISP, a Verizon or an AT&T or a Comcast has decided to now bundle C-SPAN service with something else and make me pay more, or just simply think that what we do in Congress is pretty dull and boring, and so it's okay to slow it down anyway and maybe not give us as quick of access. So I've heard loud and clear from my constituents about this issue, and the innovation economy in the Pacific Northwest is not going to be quiet about this issue. I can guarantee you it is the lifeblood of our economy, and they are going to be concerned about anything that doesn't set about the right rules for transparency and openness to the internet. I learned recently this week that Starbucks has 15 million active users and its iPhone app is doing more than 5 million transactions weekly. Okay, so take one company who prides itself on how fast it can process coffee every morning, and they know you don't really want to have a long line, because as soon as you start having a long line, then customers are going to go out the door. But now just think, a transaction that's slowed down even 5 seconds on that little app, because people are coming in and just taking their product and sweeping and saying, okay, we're getting my coffee. Now all of a sudden you slow that down by just 5 seconds, or you say you're going to make those people pay more, you're artificially increasing the price of product. So my constituents wanted us, while I know we debate a lot about movies and certain types of content, my constituents wanted me to bring the message that this affects all of commerce. And they also believe that it has a chilling effect on investment. Because if you don't get a rate of return on the investment, if you're basically saying, I'm going to maybe give you slower service in the future, then are you going to invest in your customers, or are you going to try to, fight this challenge of having slower access? So I know you, Mr. Chairman, are earnest in trying to move this forward and to try to have this discussion, but I would ask the American public, if you really are confident about the bundled services that you're getting now, and you think that's really clear and transparent, then, yes, you might like this. But otherwise, I would say to you that everything from data plans to exactly the prohibition on the FCC here would be problematic for the very principles that you are trying to protect in the bill. And while it's good to say on the one hand, we don't want throttling, we want transparency, we want all of these things, to me there are three concerns. First, it doesn't fix the fast lane problem because there's a big exemption, big enough to drive a truck through, and that's right from my constituents, and I'm happy to provide names and people. So yes, the bill calls for transparency, no blocking, no throttling, but hidden in the middle of the bill are provisions that permit cable companies and telcos to create fast lanes for vaguely defined specialized services. So this leaves the innovators without the kind of guarantee to harness the full power of the internet. Second has to do with the fact that it fails to address the middle mile internet interconnection issue and strips the FCC of any power to address its future. And finally, it jettisons the FCC's existing authority under 706 and takes all the flexibility and discretion away from the FCC, which has to be the policeman on the beat. We do not want this bill to pass and be frozen in time. This is exactly the way the rules are. We need somebody who's going to continue to make sure that innovation happens and that we move forward. So I guess my question is, because I see my time is almost up, is Mr. Kimmelman, do you have a concern? I see in your comments here about the protections, a long list of protections you are saying should be there for consumers. Do you have concerns that these, I just see these commercials all the time on TV on the telcos arguing about this data plan and that data plan, and don't be fooled by this data plan because it doesn't include this. Do you think that without transparency here, we're going to be in the same debate on data plans only as it relates to now this broadband service?
Yes, Senator Cantwell, I agree with all your points. I think that it doesn't. The draft bill addresses a number of the important issues that need to be addressed, but it does strip the FCC of forward-looking flexibility or interpretive flexibility as to how to understand these going forward. So a fast lane of speed may be illegal under this, but I do worry about a data cap for certain usage, dropped bits, which is really your example, the Starbucks example. It may not be a faster lane, a faster speed, but some people's bits get dropped, others don't. Why? Does an affiliate of an internet service provider get preferred treatment, faster treatment, better treatment, better quality of service? Those are all issues that need to be addressed. I do believe, just on the specialized service, I do want to come back because the chairman pointed out something very important. This is not new language. This is language that has appeared elsewhere. I think the tricky part for you, if you're legislating, is to understand, well, the FCC might do something with a specialized service definition, and a number of us might dispute exactly what the words are. Under the current regime, we would then have the flexibility to come back and fight that out next week, next month, 6 months from now, as applied and interpreted. So if Congress steps in and wants to make a definition like this, just urge you to be very careful about exactly what words you pick and what flexibility you give the FCC to move forward and understand how that's being used. Mr. Misener had some examples before of how it could be used anti-competitively. That would be a legitimate concern. We want an agency to have the authority to look at that.
Mr. Chairman, I know you are trying to move legislation, and I respect that. To me, these are very tricky things, and while you can say you have a 65-mile-an-hour speed limit on a highway, but if no one's there enforcing it, pretty soon people are going to drive a lot faster. And the question is, who's going to call the rules of the road here once we pass this legislation? If you just think about it, who would have thought that many consumers would be, buying coffee with an app? And yet that's a very short period of time. So it's hard to say what's going to come next. It's very important that we, to me, I want to see what the FCC does, and I hope they will truly protect net neutrality and protect an open internet. I thank the chair.
Thank the senator from Washington. The one thing I can assure you they will do is use a 1934 law to do it. This has got to be a better way, guys. Senator Nelson, you have one more question, I think.
And Senator Cantwell, congratulations on your Seahawks. That was one of the more exciting times. Mr. Chairman, I would like to have consent to put into the record a letter to you and to me from the National Association of Realtors asking that our discussions not hold up the FCC's deliberations.
That without objection.
Mr. Kimmelman, the bill that is under discussion does not contain a general non-discrimination provision, nor does it provide regulatory discretion to the FCC to make such determinations. What do you think about that?
Senator Nelson, that's a major concern to us because, again, it may look very small, but this has been the overarching principle to get at fundamental concerns about unreasonable discrimination on networks as they evolve, services as they change. And so I would hope that's not too big an ask to reconsider that issue as the legislation goes forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Nelson. I'll just ask a couple of quick questions here, too. Mr. Misener, in your prepared testimony, you suggested that the Internet is fundamentally different, both in technical design and practical operation from other major media, including newspapers, radio broadcasting, satellite TV, and cable. That's a quote from your statement. Is the internet also different in technical design and practical operation from the copper wire public switch telephone network that Title II was written specifically to address?
Of course.
And so is Title II, why wouldn't we want to come up with a new regime? I mean, why would we take something that was designed in an era of copper wire public switch telephone networks and try and apply it to the internet age?
Because that's all the agency has to work with right now.
And isn't that an argument for why Congress ought to give them some direction?
I'm not arguing against that, Senator. Mr. Chairman, I support exploring this. I have a very results-oriented perspective for this, and this is coming from our customers. They want their net neutrality. They know about the issue very strongly. They feel passionately about it. They deserve to have these net neutrality protections. And I'm a lot less concerned, and I know they're not concerned at all about how those protections are given to them. If somehow they lose their net neutrality, they will know that they lost it, and they will look to us, the people involved in this policy discussion, and say we have failed. But if instead they keep it, we will have succeeded no matter what avenue we take. And so I'm looking forward to working with you and your committee on your very common sense approach.
Let me just ask a quick question, because there were some concerns raised before and concerns raised today that the draft would threaten the FCC's ability to enforce rules on issues like universal service, accessibility 911, rural call completion. Our view is that the draft bill doesn't affect the ability of the FCC to address these issues because it has ample ancillary authority to deal with them. So that said, are the concerns that Amazon has with the discussion draft related to the FCC's ability to address issues like rural call completion or universal service?
No, Mr. Chairman. They're with respect to getting consumers and businesses the certainty that they need to invest and purchase.
So what Amazon is saying that you don't believe that the FCC needs to reclassify under Title II in order to deal with 911 or accessibility issues.
We don't have an opinion on that, Mr. Chairman. We have not studied this as well as others have. We've been laser focused on net neutrality and ensuring that the choice that is inherent in the internet is maintained for the future. And we're largely ambivalent on how that choice is maintained.
Mr. McDowell.
Mr. Chairman, the FCC has looked at voice over internet protocol and applied a lot of these types of requirements on voice over internet protocol, even though it's an information service that does not fall under Title II. That has been upheld by the appellate courts. In addition, with universal service, as I said earlier, in October of 2011, we repurposed the subsidy program to support, by the way, all of the things that Senator Booker so eloquently pointed out, as well as support for rural services, but broadband information services. We did that. That was challenged before the 10th Circuit very vehemently in one of the most aggressive, complex pieces of litigation I've ever seen in my career, and we won. And keep in mind, this was the first bipartisan entitlement reform since 1996. There were 3 Democrats and myself on the FCC, and we all agreed that that was the way to go. And that was upheld by the courts. So no, the bill as drafted in front of me today does not threaten those things. There is terrific appellate history here and precedent at the FCC to support all of those things you mentioned.
Mr. Chairman, may I just offer that I generally agree with my friend, Mr. McDowell. He's agreed with me a number of times. I will agree with him on this, except for his conclusion there for the following reason. Every time, the courts have looked askance at the FCC's use of ancillary authority, scrutinized it very carefully, and there's some inconsistency in how they have applied that. If Congress legislates, the question will be, how are you thinking about that ancillary authority? How do you want it applied? Because it's a new law. So if you intend for it to apply, as it has in telecom in the past, I would very much suggest that you write that into the proposed language.
All right. Senator Nelson, anything else for the good of the order? Senator Blumenthal?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of questions. Again, I welcome all of your willingness to work with the committee on the proposal before us, which, as you've said, raises questions but may offer some potential, a lot of potential. And I think there are questions that need to be answered, and in my own mind, the best approach may be to wait until we see what the FCC does and I've taken a position on what I think it should do. Others may agree or disagree, but the likelihood of our acting before the FCC, I think, is small anyway. But let me ask you, Mr. Misener, if, and I'm picking this company simply without any aspersion or disparagement, it's a great company. If Comcast decided to cap the amount of data a consumer is allowed to use each month, and it exempted any streaming video of its own affiliated NBC content from that cap, could the FCC, under this proposal, stop that practice?
Under the discussion draft, I am afraid not, and largely because the things underneath that ceiling, which are terrific ideas to protect net neutrality, I keep saying that it's a good list, the Commission is largely taken out of ensuring that those are actually implemented. And I think businesses like ours really are looking for the kind of certainty that only an agency which is into the details can provide it. It's great for Congress to have high-level instruction to the agency as the appropriate role, but companies like mine and many others are going to be looking to the agency for the detail and certainty of regulation that is designed to implement Congress's goals.
I certainly would welcome other responses.
Thank you.
I don't want to take too much time. Because
I'll be as quick as I possibly can, which is hard. But anyway.
I'd be happy to stay, but, I don't.
Your specific example, Comcast is living under merger conditions that would prohibit that. But second of all, even if they weren't, there is Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act. There's also common law at the state and federal level. I think there'd be an avalanche of plaintiffs, class action lawsuits
But that really
to prevent that
begs
from
the
happening.
question,
If it was anti-competitive.
The FCC is supposed to protect consumers.
Right.
So they don't have to go to.
But there's Federal Trade Commission to protect them. There's state consumer advocates to protect them. There's state attorneys general, of which you were one, there to protect them. There's lots of overlapping law here. The notion that there's no law here protecting consumers is a myth. It's an absolute myth.
But so much of what Mr. McDowell talks about is ex post only.
I'm sorry, could you repeat your point, Mr. Misener?
I'm sorry, Senator. What Mr. McDowell keeps going back to is FTC involvement in this. And if the FTC were a rulemaking authority that actually promulgated rules that companies like mine could look at and examine and know what, get the certainty from, that's one thing. But ex post regulation is not helpful in developing certainty.
It's worked thus far.
Did you have a comment, Mr.?
I was effectively going to say the same thing as Mr. Misener. The after the fact competition analysis at the FTC, whether it's antitrust or looking at unfair practices, is extremely lengthy, subject to a lot of the same litigation he's criticizing at the FCC, and has very seldom been practiced. And it survived as a sleepy little agency because it hasn't done a whole lot in this space, and it does not have rulemaking authority. So I agree with Mr. Misener. I do not believe most of the companies represented at this table, and maybe many of the senators would want to give them rulemaking authority, but that's just a guess.
And I would just say, since you've alluded to my own experience, that and I know you know an immense about this area, to say, oh well, the attorneys general can do it, sounds good, but the attorneys general are so limited in resources, and as with any law and any rule, it is dead letter unless there is effective enforcement, and the burdens of enforcement are much more substantial in reality, in practical reality, than they may seem on theory or in paper, a fact that I know you well understand from your own experience. Let me just conclude with this quick question to Mr. Kimmelman. The broadband companies, or any of you who want to address it, the broadband companies seem to receive a lot of assistance. A lot of public assistance, spectrum, public rights of way, billions of dollars in universal service funds, large open-ended liability protection, sometimes to my great chagrin from litigation in the Communications Decency Act. So the question on my mind is, why should the public, us, all of us, provide all of these very substantial benefits, but insist on only very limited consumer protections?
Well, Senator, I don't think you should. I think that those are wonderful benefits. They also raise a lot of capital in the market, and I fully respect that. I think it's very critical for our market economy. But they do get government benefits, and there should be obligations. And I think the question is, what is the right amount? What's the right balance there? And I think there is a lot in the Communications Act that can basically oblige them to do things that you think are reasonable in return for those public benefits. I would hope we would preserve those.
And I would certainly welcome other comments as long as I thank the chairman for his indulgence.
And I'll be quick, Senator. I think that's why, going back to the earlier question about the Communications Act rewrite or the modernization of the Communications Act, I think relooking at the public interest standard right now, which has been very amorphous in terms of what is acceptable, what's not acceptable, what are the give and takes that we have today, is a serious discussion to have. And again, I think that is why we cannot take that off the table as something that is very important to this country, to actually go back and update that. But we've got to get past this quagmire right now. But your point is well taken. I think it's one that should be taken up at that time.
And I'd just like to say that just end where I started, which is wireless is different, and we're different technically. When you talk about data caps and we talk about spectrum constraint, when you talk about throttling, I would say we have to optimize the networks for our users' experience so that everyone can have the best experience. And when you talk about spectrum, we've paid billions of dollars for it to the federal government and have continue to pay billions of dollars to the federal government, a $45 billion auction going on right now. So as we move forward in these discussions, I just want to put the asterisk in your mind that wireless is different from a technical, competitive, legal way. We need to make sure that we can differentiate it in the rules.
Well,
Senator,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, Senator, if I could. As a cable operator, broadband operator, we do not get free right-of-way with all that. We pay for the right-of-way in our franchise fees. We also do not receive any subsidies, unlike a number of our competitors. We are not eligible for stimulus activity and all of that. Our networks are built purely with private risk capital, and we rely on the satisfaction of our customers, frankly, for our only means of survival. So I just wanted to share that point if there's a question.
I appreciate that's a very good point, and I really do appreciate your coming all the way from South Dakota to be with us today. I hear it's a long ways away.
Yeah, that's another issue for this committee.
But I want to again thank the chairman and especially all of you. I apologize for the wait that you had, but this hearing has been very, very valuable, and you've been very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just say too, and just final question, I guess, have any of you seen what the FCC is going to do?
No.
Okay.
No.
Anybody
Absolutely not. I'm still under my ethics ban.
Right, I know,
so just
I
for the
know.
record. Okay.
All right. Anybody expect to? I mean, anybody can say
No,
this?
nothing.
Okay.
Nope.
All right. Well, and I just say that because I think this process is so much more open. I mean, yeah, I put out a draft. You're all shooting at it. That's fine. That's the way the process works. But that's why I think there's so much in terms of getting public involvement. And this has been a great hearing, and you've been a great panel. Thank you for your great answers to the questions. It's been very informative, and a lot of good questions from our senators on both sides. It's an important issue, and it's really important that we get it right. So thank you for your patience, and with that, this hearing is adjourned. And I thank my ranking member for his patience. Thanks, Bill.